inside a room that looked more like an abandoned dump full of flies, with doors and windows shut and reeking of a foul stench. A young man was sitting at his computer. It seemed like he was playing some kind of game like Minecraft. Young Sung Guy was 18 years old, and had been in that putrid state for 3 months, because he felt betrayed by everyone around him. Someone was knocking on the door furious, yelling that he was just making excuses to stay isolated. Playing games, a man was shouting at him from outside, asking when he was going to come out of that room. But he was one of the reasons Young Sung Guy didn't want to come out. The man asks the woman to grab a hammer, but she asks Yun Sung Ji's father to be more patient with the boy. After all, she had moved into the house right after his mother had left. He comforts the woman, who seemed more worried about her own future with the old man. Then with the boy in the room, pretending to be emotional as she hugs him, Sim, the old man, suggests they go out for dinner to give his son a bit more time. He asks what she would like, and as opportunistic as she was, the woman makes her move. Meanwhile, Yum Sung Ji could hear the entire conversation between those two idiots. From his room, his phone vibrates on the table and a message pops up. Someone named Kim Sung Hwan writes, saying that Yun Sung Ji's suspension had been lifted and that he could now return to school to get beaten up. Well, he was one of the reasons the kid ended up like that. 3 months earlier in a Korean school, a guy raises his fist and lands a blow squarely on someone, sending him flying. The rest of the gang watches and mocks the boy who was getting beaten, but one of them seemed to feel guilty. The boy who had been hit was Yoon Song Ji, and the gang leader tells him to get up so he can hit him again. Yoon Song Ji crawls closer and begs Song Kwan, the very boy who looked uncomfortable, for mercy because they had been friends since elementary school. He looks at his old friend lying on the ground and remembers the past, but he's quickly snapped back when the gang leader asks if he was really friends with a loser like that, so that's why he couldn't hit the kid and acted like a coward. They remark to protect his reputation, instead of saving a friend. Sam Khan decides to kick him. He keeps up the act saying they were never friends. Where had he gotten that stupid idea? Sam Hwan keeps hitting him non-stop. The other two keep fueling the humiliation. Even all bruised and swollen, Young Sun Guy speaks again, and tells him to never dare call him a friend again. He didn't want to be a loser like Young Sun Guy. Back to the present moment. He was still immersed in his game. Really, did make sense that he wanted to stay in that continuous isolation. On his screen, the game asks whether he wants to save the Hellcraft map. He clicks yes and decides to upload that new map to the game. While it was uploading, he took the chance to review some of the map's features, at least in that world reflected on his monitor. He wasn't betrayed. The young man posted the link to the new map on the game's blog, and soon after, several users sent messages thanking him for that new creation. Lying in bed, Yun Sung Ji tried to convince himself that that was all he needed. But even though he wanted to believe that staying in his room and creating maps was enough, it wasn't true in truth. He felt lonely and afraid that if he went out, he'd be betrayed again after some time asleep. He got up again. Most likely his father and that woman were already asleep. He went back to the computer to check the reviews. On the map he had created, more praise followed. Users loved how difficult and well-crafted his maps were. He was happy to know that people liked his work. Suddenly a new notification appeared in the corner of his computer screen. That message was a bit puzzling as it was written like this. Hello human. I had fun with the game. It really goes toe-to-toe with real hell. Could I speak to you in person to discuss the creation of hell? Kim Sung Ji felt like a child was inviting him to a job interview. Besides, how would they talk in person without arranging a location? A deep voice echoed from a shadowy place, saying that finding a human's location would be nothing to him. A snap of fingers followed those words. Suddenly a fiery portal began to open inside the teenager's bedroom. He looked at that light in shock, thinking his room was on fire. But out of nowhere a figure started to form amidst the flames, scaring Yum Sung Guy even more. The demon's deep voice reverberated through the room. As he introduced himself he said he was the master of the 20th hell that was about to be created, and his name was Baphomet. The protagonist let out a sigh. Surely, depression and months of isolation had finally driven him insane. He was hallucinating ghosts now. Footsteps were heard as Baphomet approached and lifted him by the arm, saying he was no mere ghost or hallucination. He had come for him to make use of the boy's talent. Yum Sung-di was in shock. It was actually real. He broke free from the demon's grip and tried to back away. But Baphomet told him to calm down because if he didn't, he'd rip out his brain and eat it to absorb his knowledge. Now sitting as if they were in a job interview, the two stared at each other while the boy opened a can of soda. So if he was a real demon, the boy asked, and Baphomet said he wasn't just real, he was one of the upper demons, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. He drank from the soda can, and Yom Sung-gae asked if he had seen the Hellcraft map he had created. Baphomet said yes and added that he was impressed by his skills. That map wasn't particularly impressive. Yet despite being inescapable, he had made it look like there was still light at the end of the tunnel. A false hope cleverly designed as traps to torment players. Despite the cruelty, it maintained a certain dignity in its design. Yum Sung-gae looked at him, thinking he had created the map, inspired by his overwhelming resentment. The demon said that hell was starting to run out of space, and needed to be expanded quickly. And Baphomet had been chosen to be the master of this new hell. Therefore he wanted Yom Sung-gae to be the creator. He wanted this new place to resemble Hellcraft, or perhaps be even worse. Boy thought deeply about it, but he had no intention of getting involved with the demon. He just wanted to keep living the way he was now. Amid all that garbage, how could he be satisfied with such a miserable life? Baphomet questioned. Still had one more offer to make with the projection of a new hell. They'd need to run some tests before the official opening. That bit of information made the boy a bit more interested. So the final proposal was that if he created that hell, he would have free will to imprison any sinner he wanted in. Those who had betrayed him, wouldn't he like to send them to a hell of his own creation? It seemed like Yin Sung-gae had made his decision. Due to his weakness and hatred toward those who had wronged him, he decided he would be the new creator, and took the key that was offered to him. If accepting to create a hell meant he could take revenge on those worms, he would do anything without a second's hesitation. He grabbed the key as if he had been waiting for that moment all along. Baphomet clasped his hands together, and from that moment on their contract was sealed. Baphomet asked what kind of hell he would like to create, because to create a hell 2 essential elements were necessary. The boy asked what those things were. The first was that hell needed to have a crime as its theme, such as the hell of greed, the hell of lies among others. So he'd have to think of another sin or crime to use. Since greed and lies already existed, he would have to come up with the main theme that involved the people he wanted to punish. And the second rule was that hell had to have an architecture that was inescapable. The purpose of hell was to torture its sinners forever. So if souls managed to escape, that hell would disappear and its owner would face death. In other words, if there was any flaw in the hell created by Yom Sung-gae, Baphomet would be held responsible. But he had nothing to worry about. The demon replied if a flaw did appear and he ended up dying, he'd make sure to destroy the young man's soul first. Yom Sung-gae swallowed hard for a moment. While it was time to begin, Baphomet snapped his fingers, and everything around them began to change. The clouds turned red. Storm lightning filled the city sky. One of the bolts struck the young man's house and affected his computer. Gradually the game on his screen began to change its design. As he used the game to program the new location, the demon's subordinates would be building it in real time. It seemed like everything in Yun Sung-gae's computer was completely connected to hell. It was time for that human to show what he was capable of. A construction sign was placed, and Baphomet calmly watched it all unfold. He seemed to have really liked that soda he was drinking. One after another his subordinates looked ready to begin construction. They were just waiting for Yun Sung-gae's command. An arrow appeared and the foreman gave the signal to the small minions. They all moved to an area where they started building block by block. Meanwhile Baphomet observed the human in his room. Since they had made the contract, in the human world 7 days, 4 hours and 37 minutes have passed. That human, without even sleeping properly, was creating a magnificent castle. At first glance, was that human special? Or was it his hatred that made him special? The demon wondered. He had definitely made a good choice. From Baphomet's screen he heard Yum Sung-gae say, the project was done. He clapped and congratulated him. Human had created the hell he wanted faster than expected. Now all that was left was to choose a name. And Yom Sung-gae replied saying betrayal. It would be the hell for traitors. On the computer screen, the same question appeared again. One he was already used to. He clicked yes, and the new map, Hell of the Traitors, was saved. Stood up and, after so many months, left his room and saw his stepmother in the kitchen. It was time for revenge. Baphomet reminded him that he could only send to the hell he created those who had committed the sin of betrayal. That was one of the conditions for it to work. He had understood if the conditions weren't met, it wouldn't function, but if the key reacted, it would open the gates of hell and drag all the sinners inside. The young man approached his stepmother, who was distracted taking pictures of her new purse. Well, look who crawled out of his hole. You should take a shower, she said. You stink just like your mother, she added. Sung-gai looked at the key in his hand. It was a complicated choice. Since hell had been created so recently, there was no way a sin could have been committed in that time frame. He would probably have to wait a few days. But his stepmother kept being vile, asking why he had to come out of the room while she was around. Meanwhile, she was picking which purse photo to post. The more she complained, the more he wanted to send her to his hell right away, because she was definitely scum who deserved to suffer. 23. His mother had been sold into an arranged marriage between families. Because of that, the poor woman had suffered at the hands of her husband's relatives her entire life. Even so, she always smiled at Sung-gi whenever he was nearby. Everything had gone wrong. She was probably the one who should have cried the most, yet she kept that smile on her face. Sung-gi couldn't stand hearing the fights and seeing his mother show up hurt afterward, acting like nothing had happened. But eventually she lost her place at the table. If it had at least been for love, it would have been less infuriating me. Replaced by a younger woman clearly only interested in money. The worst part was that Sung-gi would hear her bad-mouthing his father to her friends, and the Viper never bothered to hide it, even threatening him. If he didn't want to be kicked out like his mother, he'd better stay quiet. She was nothing but a parasite who wanted to spoil herself at others' expense, even if it meant destroying a family. Sung-gi remained there while she grew more and more irritated, so he built up the courage to ask how much she'd be willing to take to leave his father. The woman looked at him, confused by the sudden question. He said she didn't have to pretend in front of him. It was obvious she was only with his dad for the money. The stepmother felt insulted by that. Who did that brat think he was? But then he made an unexpected offer. The 100 million won his father had saved for college, and he knew exactly where his father kept the investment notebook. Altogether, it would amount to around 1 billion won. Her eyes lit up with greed as she heard that. She didn't believe him he could show her. Still doubtful, the stepmother stood up to follow him, and watched as he opened the safe. Up until then she had only thought about getting a few luxury items. She wanted maybe even a property in her name. But if what Sung-gi was saying was true, she was set for life. He finished opening the safe, and there they were: gold bars, investment books, and a good amount of cash. To convince her, he took a portion and said that with that money, she could go live her life abroad if she wanted. But something didn't sit right with her. Why was he doing this out of nowhere? Baphomet appeared amused by the scene. It seemed even a woman like her still had some intuition left. What should they do now to make her accept? Well, it was showtime. Without much effort, Sung-gi started crying, saying he just wanted his mother to come back. If that woman left, maybe his mother would return. Even the demon was stunned by the boy's performance. He had truly played a strong hand. He really acted like a child. And this was as easy as taking candy from one. She grabbed her purse and started stuffing it with the money. As expected, she fell for it like a clueless duck into a trap. With that, the sin of betrayal against his father was complete. She asked for the bank and card passwords, but he said that wouldn't be necessary. Not in the hell she was about to go to. The woman turned to look at him, confused, and the key began to glow. Sung-gi inserted and turned it. Lightning spread across the room and a door appeared. A sinister click was heard and the door opened. Scaled tentacles appeared out of nowhere and began binding the traitor, dragging her straight to hell as she screamed in despair. But her screams vanished the moment the door closed. Sung-gi had just sent a living person directly to hell. She landed in a concrete room, completely inescapable. Suddenly, the walls began to close in, making the space tighter and tighter. Baphomet watched everything through his viewer. He asked if Sung-gi wanted to see, but the boy said he was feeling a bit nauseous. The demon asked if he was feeling guilty about what he'd done, but he was caught off guard when he saw that human laughing. Yum Sung-gae rushed to put on his school uniform, having been secluded for so long. He was thinner than expected. The demon stared in disbelief. It hadn't even been an hour since he'd sent that woman to hell, and he was already moving on to his next target. In response, the boy said that as long as the sword was in his hands, he would keep fighting after all. An empty hell was no hell at all. Doing it for personal satisfaction might be questionable, but in the end Baphomet had to agree. The screams of the damned are what make hell real, and filling it with more souls would be sophisticated. Yum Sung-gae zipped up his backpack and got ready to leave. It had been 3 months since he last went to school, and without hesitation he left home in search of the next sinner. Little by little the hell of betrayal was growing in population. This was turning out to be more exciting than he'd imagined already. The schoolroom 2 row 4. Several people looked out the window. Someone joked asking if it was some kind of celebrity, and they answered saying Yum Sung-gae was back. No one could believe what they were seeing. He really was back, but hadn't he dropped out of school? Why did he return? Everyone wondered. However, the real concern was that everyone knew the school gang would go after him again, and as expected they weren't going to let his return slide. Everyone knew the atmosphere in the room was going to turn bad again. They were anxious to see what would happen, and how his return would affect everything. But Yum Sung-gae had a different plan in mind. For Kim Sung-gwan and his gang, they opened the door with their target already in sight. The idiot really came back, said the leader. They surrounded him, saying he should have warned them he was coming. They would have prepared a warm welcome. Baphomet misunderstood the whole thing, thinking that Yum Sung-gae was actually popular and a celebrity among the students. But unfortunately that wasn't the case. One of the gang members threw the protagonist's notebook on the ground. He complained, saying that thanks to him, he now had a stain on his school record. He caused trouble, he had to pay. If you don't want to become entertainment for everyone here, you better come with us quietly, said one of the boys. They all went to the boys' bathroom around 5 against 1. What a cowardly setup. The annoying one kept whining about his school record. They were trying to put the blame for beating up Yum Sung-jae on the victim himself, as if Sung Hwan had just been an unlucky guy caught in the middle. Silent as ever, he remained quiet while listening to all that nonsense. And just as expected, the first punch landed straight on his face. That silence was really bothering the big guy. Baphomet watched the events unfold, as if it were playing on a cinema screen. So this was what they called cornering the victim. While judging by how things are going, it'll be hard to make any of them commit the sin of betrayal, he commented. So what would Yum Sung-gae do after all? He wiped the blood from his mouth. His goal was obvious: to send them all to hell. As the demon had said, there was no trust between him and the bullies, so he couldn't manipulate a sin of betrayal that involved himself. Humans had always used weapons to take down creatures far bigger than themselves. He just had to use his head, and for this hunt the most powerful weapon he could use against them was actually pretty simple. The gang laughed at him when they saw him reaching into his pocket, thinking he had brought a knife for self-defense. But to everyone's surprise, he pulled out 5,000 reis. What he would use against the group was the power of money. But there was no reason to try and bribe them. They could just beat him up and take the money afterward. I'll take the beating, that's fine. But it's really unfair for you to do this, he said. Baphomet got excited with the way things were going. Yum Sung-gae threw the stack of money on the floor. Besides the beating, he had only one request to make. Sung Hwan gritted his teeth and went in for the attack, but was stopped midway. The leader said they should hear him out. After all, there was money involved, just like the protagonist wanted. They had taken the bait. He bent down and picked up the money, saying that if he managed to hand over 5 grand just like that, then he probably had more. Where that came from. So what's your request, he asked. He looked at Kim Sam-kwan and said his request was for them to beat him up. Everyone turned to look at the boy from before, who was now in shock. If that amount wasn't enough, he had more in his pocket. Let's destroy Kim Sung-hwan, who betrayed me when we were still friends, said Yum Sung-gae. His trap was set. It was time for the hunt. A laugh echoed. Maybe this idiot is actually interesting, said the leader. He stuffed the money into his pocket. He congratulated Kim Sam-gon for his last performance of denial, but it seemed that, in the end, the two really were friends. A little act of payback. Consider the next few minutes as just that. He added. The big guy tried to hold the boy, but he dodged his arm. What the hell are you talking about? He tried to defend himself. We were never friends. Why are you trusting scum like Yum Sung gay scum? We're just taking a bit of money from a friend. What's so hard to understand? The leader answered shamelessly. Kim Sung Kwan couldn't believe what he was hearing. He looked furiously at the boy on the floor. He grabbed him by the collar, asking who he thought he was to drag him into that mess, and how he had the nerve to do that to a friend. What kind of friend was he even talking about anyway? But then Yun Sung Gae corrected himself. Since they were childhood friends, it was only fair to go through that horrible experience together. The brown-haired boy got pissed and went to hit the protagonist, but was stopped. Someone grabbed his collar and threw him aside with force. Well, they had been paid to do this. It was time to deliver. He tried to negotiate the price per punch, to see how many it would take to add up to 5,000. And Yom Sung Gai agreed to the idea of 500 reals per punch, which would give around 10 hits. Without waiting even a second more, they started counting the hits while he watched. This is how people felt watching others get physically humiliated. The sound was softer than what he remembered. When he was the one getting beaten. How annoying, he commented. Why did those guys find this so fun? He reached into his pocket for the key, creating conflict within the gang and making them betray each other. It was a very different move from what he did with his stepmother. Baphomet noted. The human prepared to open the portal and called the gang's attention. It was like they'd been stung. They all turned to look at Yum Sung Dai at once. They asked what he was doing, and the protagonist simply replied that it was time to see how brave they really were. He inserted the key and the portal began to form. He turned around and the iron door opened. The tentacles appeared again, grabbing them one by one, and all were pulled inside. But one still tried to hold on. But Yun Sung Gi would show no mercy. After all, the leader was known by the other students as a demon. Scenes of what they had done to him flashed through his mind. Every humiliation, every punch. Every moment of psychological torment. Now that trash was surely going to feel right at home. He pried off the last finger of the leader holding on to the door, and he was completely devoured. The only one left was Kim Sung Guan, who trembled like a chihuahua. Yom Sung Gai turned to face his former friend. Baphomet watched the two boys intrigued. The protagonist slowly approached while the other backed away in fear. Wasn't he curious about what had just happened? He asked. Might sound unreal, but he had just opened the gates of hell. He received the key just a few hours ago. Kim Sung-hoon then asked if he was being spared. At that moment, distant memories of the two from their childhood crossed his mind. Those had been such tender and happy days. He returned to reality, not knowing what the other thought of him now. But despite everything, he still considered him a friend. So that being he took before, that was enough. Kim Sung-hoon said the other might not believe it, but he had been afraid of those guys too. Hearing that was a relief. They might slowly be able to rebuild the friendship they once had. The protagonist was leaving, but he accidentally dropped the key on the floor. Upon seeing it, Kim Sung-hwan remembered what his friend had said, and what that key could do. Without thinking twice, he rushed to the key and picked it up. You idiot, don't start acting all high and mighty. After sending them to beat me up, he said, but when he opened his hand to look at the key, he saw it was just a regular key. Yim Song Gai had deliberately dropped his room key. The real one was still in his hand. He had truly lost his chance at redemption. And one more sinner was dragged into the hell of betrayal. Baphomet applauded. That had been quite the show, full of twists until the very end. But he said the last one wasn't meant to be a trap. It was a test. He truly wanted to give his old friend a chance. The one who had betrayed him was now a rock bottom. Though in hell there wasn't exactly a rock bottom. Everyone suffered the same. But still, while things were about to get boring again, it was time to make hell a bit more chaotic once more. Yom Sung Gi washed his face, still gradually coming to terms with his new reality. The demon commented that he couldn't figure him out, which intrigued him greatly. When he sent the stepmother to hell, he thought he was some kind of vengeful, evil being, but when he saw his classmate, he let his emotions speak as if he were repulsed by what he'd done. Well, he was the last being who would judge him for that, but some might feel suffocated in a way. Yam Sung Gae turned off the water and said Baphomet could relax. He wasn't going to let any of that mess with his head. That discomfort he was feeling wasn't because he felt pity or guilt. He felt pathetic for not having erased those traitors from his life sooner, for letting them ruin it more and more. That human surprised him. Baphomet was thoroughly impressed. He had made the right choice. The sun was setting over the city and now he was finally home. But he couldn't say everything was in perfect shape. After all, there was a demon with his head sticking out the living room window. In a very non-traditional way, it looked like he was watching a man enter the building. As soon as he was sure who it was, the demon announced that Yom Sung Ji's father had just arrived. The young man remained silent, thinking Baphomet was very excited to see what the next trap he would set would be, because clearly there was no bond of trust with his father, considering he had been reclusive for almost 6 months, and the money trap wouldn't work, since the money he had used belonged to the old man. Yun Sung Ji said he didn't intend to use that kind of trap. He knew very well it wouldn't work. They both heard someone opening the door and entering the apartment. Baphomet was practically begging for a spoiler. The door opened slightly. It seemed that Yun Sung Ji's father owned a small insurance company, and that company had very high premium rates. In other words, he made a living by denying payouts to people who regularly paid for premium insurance. His father arrived and asked who he was talking to, as if it wasn't enough to be locked up in your room playing video games. Now you've developed schizophrenia. He said, looks like you're becoming a failure just like your mother. The old man added. The young son guy looked at the key glowing in his pocket and held it up to Baphomet. As he had said before, there was no need to use any trap on his father. Another victim had just been betrayed by that man today. Upon hearing what his son said, the old man prepared to teach him a lesson. But before he could complete the motion of the slap, the young son guy activated the portal. He had thought about why his father had abandoned his mother, and why he was always so cruel to his own son. It seemed that his routine of denying people their rights had turned betrayal into a habit. The young man finished turning the key, and the iron gate opened once again. His father was confused by it all. It didn't take much with just a goodbye. Another sinner was being dragged into the hell he had created. The old man pleaded to be let go. But his son replied that where he was going, there was no escape. The gates closed, and the only thing left were faint remnants of screams. Coming from behind them, Baphomet watched the prison where the man had been sent. But aside from the sounds coming from his screen, silence reigned in the room. Yum Sung Guy stood up and walked to a picture frame that had fallen on the shelf. It was an old family photo. The demon asked if his revenge was over and what his next plans were. He was very anxious his revenge was over, and without anyone expecting such a twist, he said it was now time to turn himself in to the police. Already at the station he told the officers everything he had done, with Baphomet accompanying him. Suddenly a portal opened and one of his subordinates appeared. It seemed that Lucifer wanted to speak to him. It was probably to discuss the new hell that had just been created. He got up and opened the portal so he could go speak with the boss. The castle of the king of hell appeared, and a council made up of 11 demons was waiting for Baphomet. The doors opened and he entered the grand hall. A smooth voice echoed saying that now all 12 had arrived. That voice belonged to none other than Lucifer himself. King of hell Lucifer was seated on his throne, watching the arrival of the master of the 20th hell. Baphomet looked around the room, wondering why all 12 demons, who normally didn't get along at all, were gathered there. Lucifer asked him to take a seat. He walked to his chair, but before sitting down, he asked for an explanation since he had been the last to arrive. But with no patience whatsoever, the king ordered him to sit. A magic circle opened and Baphomet was pulled down into his seat. Everyone was sitting there because Lucifer had commanded. No one was there willingly. That was Gargamel, one of the high-ranking demons. It looked like they were going to discuss some new rules about the hells, something none of the demons present were happy about. King said he had given each of them the opportunity to create their own hell, but as with any contract, at no point did he ever say that each of them would own their own hell. In other words, he never promised that the hell they created would become the official hell. A woman named Liz and joined the conversation and said that the hells they created would then be their responsibility. But they would not be official hells exactly, said Lucifer, and the most interesting part of it all was that none of them had created their hell alone. They had all hired a human of interest to help with the creation. Baphomet thought the others wouldn't have had the same insight he did, but it actually made sense. In the end, the most grandiose hell ever created was the hell of disbelief, planned by Dante, a human, A strange eye began to move as if it wanted to speak. That was Sadius, another high-ranking demon, and he wanted to know what Master Lucifer had in mind. He answered that it was quite simple. He would choose the best hell to become part of. The official hell, and the rest would be exterminated. Everyone was shocked to hear that, and what they feared was true. Lucifer wanted a battle to take place between the creators of those hells back at the police station. Sung Guy was now in the interrogation room. He had gone to the station to create confusion in the investigation and reported the disappearance of his father and stepmother. But not everything went as expected. There had been a report about the disappearance of a group of bullies. Desperate parents were begging for their children to be found. In the end, 6 people had vanished in the same neighborhood in just one day, and he was the only link between all of them. So why hadn't he acted with more caution from the start? Why had he done everything all at once within just a day or two? Well, the explanation was obvious. Because there was no way they could convict him as guilty. The only connection was between him and the missing people. There wasn't a single living soul who had seen him open the gates of hell, and much less any evidence like weapons or bodies to be found. There are always links between missing people, but the law wasn't simple enough to convict someone based on that alone. Sung-gi smiled. He would likely be released soon. The junior investigator told his senior that, despite everything they tried, they had no evidence against that boy. What were they going to do? An amateur like him couldn't have hidden all the evidence without leaving a single trace like that. Well, in this situation, the only thing they could do was let the boy go, said Detective Chief Park Sang-sik. But before that, he wanted to have one more word with the kid, and asked his subordinate to turn off the microphone. He opened the door to the room where Sung-gi was, and apologized for all that happening. Right after the disappearance of his parents, Park Sang-sik tossed out a bait, saying they weren't doing it because they wanted to. He was convinced the boy hadn't killed anyone. Sung-gi remained silent. He really hadn't killed anyone. Only sent them to hell. He was surprised to hear his own voice, as he was sure he had only thought that, not spoken it, but in front of him. The detective was holding a strange key just like his own. Park Sang-sik asked if he was surprised. It seemed that Sung-gi wasn't the only one chosen by a commander from hell. The boy was truly in shock. That was the last thing he'd expected. The detective said he was surprised too. But he didn't expect a confession like that to come so easily. He approached Sung-gi. While the young man was lost in conflicting thoughts, that man's intuition really seemed sharp. And he couldn't tell if he had gotten close knowing something, or if he just took a chance and caught him off guard. But putting all that aside, one thing was certain as the two stared at each other. Sung-gi thought that, if necessary, he just sent the guy to hell like the others. Manipulating a sin of betrayal against that detective couldn't be too hard. Suddenly, both were surprised by a portal opening, and Baphomet appeared in the middle of the interrogation. On the other side of the room, another portal opened and Gargoyman made his entrance. Sung-gi was shocked to see another demon. "Looks like we've met again," said Gargoyman as they could see the humans. The two of them had ended up crossing paths. The masked demon said it was good they had met again, but that Baphomet should keep better control of his pet, because it seemed his little nerd was ready to open the gates of hell at any moment. The horned demon told his human to stay calm. The games hadn't even begun yet. Sung-gi asked what was going on. He hadn't expected that there were other humans like him. Baphomet responded saying he hadn't expected it either, but just like him, seemed the other demons were also using humans to create their hells, and only one of the 12 created hells would be the winner. Therefore the game of death would soon begin. Gargamel told the detective to let the boy go for now, because if he were released, he could potentially deal with other opponents, reducing the number of competitors. The detective said he had already been considering letting him go, because legally there was no way to prove the kid's crimes. Besides, he was also using powers from hell, which made him just as much a criminal as Sung-gi. Baphomet added that they were human after all, and that made them useful. But Gargamel was right. If they started using their powers too early, it would be hard to survive until the end of the game. Well, if they allowed it. Baphomet still had a lot to explain to his human. The detective opened the door and the two of them left together. Sung-gi seemed outraged to learn there were other humans like him still in the room. The man holding hands said Park Sang-sik didn't need to worry. His hell was much better than the other two. For now, they just use the others as scapegoats and defeat them when necessary. Park Sang-sik said he'd do whatever it took to survive until the end, because only then would a just society be formed. It was already nighttime by the time Yoon Sung-gae got home. He collapsed on his bed, taken by the fact that the guy had not only discovered his power, but was also a creator of hells. The young man shouted that he could have been arrested or worse, sent to hell. Baphomet told him to cut the drama, since it was the human himself who had chosen to turn himself in to the police. Yim Sung-gi tried to shift the blame, accusing Baphomet of not informing him about other humans like him. But before he could keep whining, the demon grabbed him by the face and slammed him against the wall. Jim Sung-gi had better watch his mouth. He wasn't dealing with just anyone, but with a superior demon who could steal his soul in a blink. The boy swallowed hard and Baphomet let go of him. The demon was just as angry, because he hadn't known that Lucifer had ordered the other demons to create their own hells too, much less that he'd tell all 12 to fight one another, to determine which one was the best. His rage at Lucifer's decision was more than obvious. Yoon Sung-gae asked about the game of death, trying to confirm if the goal was simply to survive until the end, and Baphomet asked if the human really thought he was capable of that. At first the young man needed to learn the rules of the game, and what had happened while he was being interrogated at the police station. The demon agreed with him and said he'd show him. He raised 2 fingers to Yun Sung-gi's eyes, making him curse from the pain. Unfortunately, that method of showing was better than explaining. Everything went dark and then a light appeared. An image of a man began to form in his vision, and out of nowhere Lucifer was in front of them. Yom Sung-gi could see everything happening in full detail, as if he were right there in that moment. Someone raised their hand and said that Lucifer's thirst for war was a great idea. That man was Lam the Flaming Eagle. But in order to prepare, he continued, they needed to know the rules of the game. Lucifer seemed to think about it. What he actually wanted was for the chosen humans to fight and send each other to hell. You don't know the sin tied to each other's hell, just like your humans don't know either. Manipulate your chosen ones and make them set traps to send their opponents here. In other words, it would be a game of tag, where you don't know who your enemies are, and the last one standing is the winner. Lam explained. Lucifer agreed with what that demon had said. That way they could see which of the hells was truly universal, and how unique a hell created by a human could be. Lam raised his hand again, and asked if there were any other rules besides that, and the king said they couldn't use their own demon powers to help the humans. Any other method was allowed, as long as it was the humans who sent each other to hell. The vision dissolved and he returned to reality. Now he understood why the game was called the Game of Death, because there was no choice. Even if he wasn't the hunter, someone would come after him. Eventually Baphomet agreed, saying that rule applied to him as well. After all, demons are connected to their own hells by contract, meaning along with the humans, all the demons would cease to exist except for one. It really was a lot of information to process. But in truth, Yom Sung-di couldn't care less about Baphomet's life. Even if he ended up in someone else's hell, he would take it as karma coming back to him. There was only one concern in his mind, and he decided to ask Baphomet what would happen to the people trapped in his hell if he ended up imprisoned in one of his opponent's hells. Well, that answer was simple. They would disappear too. So there was no easy way out. Yom Sung-gi had to get his best, because he didn't want those bastards who were in prison to have a peaceful death. Baphomet shivered at those words. The young man he had chosen was insane. He didn't want to survive to save himself, but to ensure that his sinners kept suffering. Ensuring eternal suffering was the essence of hell. There was no way he could let what he had created fall apart like that. Right or wrong, Baphomet was glad to have a human like him by his side. Maybe becoming the master of a new hell wasn't such a distant dream. After all, the demon reached out his hand and said he recognized him as his partner, and the two saluted each other. But from afar, it seemed someone was literally watching them. Ceaus and his human Huminch were standing on top of a building, observing them from a distance. It seemed the games were really about to begin. Im Sung-gi wrote the rules on a sheet of paper. Summed up, there were 4 rules. Rule 1, victory is decided when one creator imprisons the other. Rule 2, demons can help but without using their powers. Rule 3, any method can be used, and rule for the process continues until there is one winner left, unless Lucifer changed his mind and added more rules. Those were the conditions. So here came the first question. To what extent could the demons help? Aside from authoritarian power, what other abilities did they have? Asked Yum Sung-gai. Well, the authoritarian power was the power Lucifer had given to each of them, such as the ability to move through portals, the hellfire they could emit from their bodies, and the power to command lower demons. But besides this authoritarian power, each demon had a unique ability, the one they were born with. Sung-gai became curious about that and asked what Baphomet's innate ability was. He answered that his ability was to detect death. Since childhood, he had always been able to sense those near death and guide them to hell. Intrigued, the boy asked if he could explain in more detail how that ability worked. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. Liam Sung-gai wasn't expecting anyone. He answered the intercom and saw that a girl was at his door. She said she had something to show him, not really understanding what that meant. He replied with a yes, and out of nowhere, she began to unbutton her blouse. Caught off guard, the young Sung-gai asked what she was doing, and told her to leave before he called the police, then hung up the intercom. Baphomet stuck his head out of his room, and suddenly, a miasma began to fill the space that was the essence of death. Just like he had mentioned earlier, that woman at the intercom had come to try and take Yum Sung-gai's life. The boy was surprised to hear that, but soon his brain kicked into gear. He'd been reclusive, and hadn't done anything to justify a stranger coming to kill him. So there was only one answer. That one was definitely also a hell creator. Huiminch took the glowing key from her pocket. Yum Sung-gai's reaction had been enough for the sin of lust to be activated. She put the key back in her pocket, and now all she had to do was break the door down and invade the house to send her opponent to hell. As a precaution, the girl confirmed with her demon, and Sadia's simply nodded yes. His observation skills really were amazing. He had found the creator faster than she expected, and since he hadn't come out, all she had to do was go in and it would be over. Huiminch raised her hammer and began smashing it against the door. Yum Sung-gai was shocked by the audacity of that woman. She was literally hammering his door. He needed to think fast of a way to fight her, because her key had definitely been activated. It didn't take much thought for him to realize that the sin tied to her was lust. The knocking on his door continued relentlessly. He grabbed his key and started trying to think of a plan. When he answered the intercom, he didn't know she was also one of his opponents, so he couldn't prepare in advance. Could that act count as a sin of betrayal? Baphomet explained that what she did was still too shallow to be considered a sin for the key to be activated. The opponent had to abandon their faith. Obviously, a casual action like that didn't equate to the sin of betrayal. Even if it was intentional, the rules of hell weren't that lenient. But Yum Sung-gai seemed very calm. So Baphomet asked if he still had another card up his sleeve. Another hammer blow echoed against his door. The other party had already activated their key, and intended to enter the house, said the protagonist as he approached the door, until he stood in front of it. He had to make her believe he was capable of summoning his power. The moment the door opened, the young man sat in front of the door, and warned the woman outside that, if she came in she would go straight to hell. Though confused for a second, she concluded he was bluffing and continued hammering the door. The girl confirmed what he had already guessed. She was forcing her way in, because she had already triggered the conditions. To open her hell's door, she finally managed to break the doorknob. Yum Sung-gai gave her a second warning, saying that if she stepped in, she'd fall directly into his hell. Huiminch definitely wasn't expecting that. He wasn't begging for his life, nor was he hiding from her. So could what he was saying actually be true? She wondered just as expected. She fell for his bait like a duckling. He asked if she was curious to know why he wasn't running away, and began explaining that the hell he was responsible for was the hell of invasion. She looked through the hole in the door, and the two stared at each other. It was in fact a half-bluff, but he had to play with the cards he had. There was nothing in Lucifer's rules that said he couldn't lie about the theme of his own hell. Baphomet looked at him with admiration. Despite the short time he had already managed to come up with a trap, but as a human with high intelligence, Huiminch also knew there was a high chance that it was a lie. Probability of it being a bluff was certainly over 90%. But what if in the end it was real? What if she really opened the door and triggered the condition for Yun Sung Ji's hell? She imagined that scenario and convinced herself she didn't want the game to end there. A moment of silence followed as she considered all the possible outcomes. Possibility 1, insert her key into the lock and activate her hell, but in return it might also activate her opponent's condition. Possibility 2, retreat, but if she did that the other player wouldn't fall for it again. Yim Sung Ji would remember that attack and know the condition for activating human chase hell. In other words, potential checkmate. Each option carried a big risk. What should she do? It seemed like Yun Sung-gae was reading her mind as he commented on all the doubts and possibilities that had passed through her head. Then he offered her an option that would supposedly benefit both sides, with which was the option of forming an alliance. She mocked that idea. After all, there would only be one winner at the end of that game, so if they formed an alliance, at some point they have to betray each other. Yum Sung Ji kept trying to persuade her, asking if she really thought she could take on the other 10 participants by herself. That comment made Hu Mincha hesitate. She truly wouldn't be able to use the same method she had used today on every other participant. Besides, there was a chance that he could form an alliance with someone else and leak the sin behind her, held to the other players, and she wouldn't even be able to use her surprise attacks anymore. Not knowing what to do, she asked Sadius what the best option would be, but the demon replied that he also didn't know what the best decision was. Not giving her much time to think, Yom Sung-gae gave her his phone number and said that if she wanted to form an alliance, all she had to do was call him. That way she wouldn't trigger the conditions of his hell. Since she had broken the door, the police were probably on their way, so she better leave quickly. Even though she still wasn't entirely sure about it, Human Che picked up her phone and wrote down the number Yum Sung-gae had given her. Seen things hadn't gone the way she wanted. Apparently, her opponents really were on the same intelligence level as her. He held it in until she left and then dropped the act. The games had barely begun, and he had already almost been eliminated. Baphomet commented that he suspected there might be a demon with the ability to detect other users, but he hadn't expected them to be the first. But more importantly, Yum Sung Ji truly deserved praise. His quick thinking had surprised him. Once again they kept talking and discussing their next steps. Yom Sung-gae was making some changes to his hell through the game when a message popped up on his phone. Hyun Min Cha had agreed to form an alliance with him. For the time being he looked at his phone, thinking that just surviving today was already a victory. If she leaked any information about their alliance or his power, Yom Sung-gae could activate his hell of betrayal. That had really been a brilliant move. Meanwhile, at the police department, Detective Park Sang-sik was checking some confidential files. He seemed deeply focused in his research, looking for other creators like himself. Gargamon asked if he was using his power for that. It wouldn't be such a bad idea, but the number of missing people was too high, so even if he wanted to use his power, it was more complicated than expected. Someone seemed to enter his office and asked if he was already about to leave. The detective questioned what his assistant was doing there at that hour, and the young man replied he was just doing a small restock. The young man opened the drawer to put away his bag, and took the chance to mention that earlier, they'd received a report of an attempted break-in at Yim Sung Ji's house. It seems some crazy student had tried to invade his home. When the police arrived at the scene, the victim was fine and the girl had already left. Finally he had a lead. He was sure the girl who went after Yom-sung was also a hell creator. Who would have thought that nerd was doing so well? He asked them to pull up the camera footage to find out who the girl that attacked the property was. In addition to the footage, the detective had one more request. He wanted his subordinate to keep an eye on the boys' movements throughout the week, but while the players, who already knew each other's identities, were analyzing one another. In another part of the city, the first elimination occurred. An old man was kneeling while a well-dressed man stood in front of him. It seemed that the man standing was Jam's player. The old man begged the young man to save him, and complained to his demon, saying he wasn't the kind to commit sins. But the well-dressed man approached the old man, saying that sometimes your very existence is a sin. The fact that the old man was using up oxygen with his useless life was something that man simply couldn't tolerate. Even as he pleaded for mercy, the gates of hell opened and his soul was sucked in. His demon began to disappear, saying that this time Jam had gotten lucky. But before he could say anything else, the human stepped on the pink demon and called him incompetent. Jam asked him to stop like it or not. That demon under his foot was from the upper ranks of hell. But without any fear the man turned to him and said that if he didn't want that to happen, he better do his job right. The hack eagle demon stared in disbelief, wondering if he had really heard that correctly. But the human retracted his words, saying he was just kidding. They were partners after all. Well, now there were only 10 participants left. If they could capture them all, their utopia would finally be created. 3 days had passed since the incident with Fabiana, and Yom Sangai had taken the time to rest, as if he were on vacation from work. Baphomet stared at him, trying to understand what the human strategy was 3 days ago. Not only had they survived 2 competitors, but they had also formed an alliance. And yet, surprisingly, nothing had been done since then. If they wanted to be the winners, shouldn't they be taking action? Young Sangai said he understood his frustration. He wasn't the type to just sit and wait either, so he was feeling restless too. The demon then asked why the human seemed so relaxed. Well, first off, a game like this was progressive. Toward the end, there was usually no time to rest or even gather information. In other words, once the game truly began, 2 of them definitely wouldn't be able to sleep. Always either the hunted or the hunter. Secondly, if he was starting to lose patience, then someone was bound to make a mistake. After all, there were always idiots who preferred to win the battle rather than the war. So he wanted to begin the hunt only. When an aggressive player was drawn into one of his traps, his phone started ringing. It looked like Hu Min-che was calling over the phone. She complained that it had been 3 days since they formed the alliance, and he hadn't contacted her once. He replied that he had been strategically doing nothing, waiting for someone to commit the sin invasion. She sighed in frustration and commented that while he was off the grid, an incident had already happened. Apparently something interesting had been posted on Streamer, and he needed to see it. Huiminch sent the link so Yun Sung Ji could also watch the video. A streamer named Kagaka appeared on his screen, and during his live stream, he said he was participating in some kind of game. Not just any game, but one similar to the Hunger Games, where none of the participants knew each other's identities. And since everyone's strategy seemed to be the same, hiding until someone made the first move, the game wasn't exciting at all. Being someone enthusiastic, he had expected this game of death to be filled with more screams and chases. So he decided to reveal his identity first. That way the start would finally be triggered, and participants could choose between stealing his key or hunting down other players who targeted him. So he invited everyone to his house that very night at midnight, leaving the exact location in the comments. Baphomet and Neon Sun Guy stared at the phone, not believing what they had just seen. Just like they'd been waiting, it was time to take the first step. Of course, in an event like that, they could identify other players, and it would be a great opportunity to reduce the numbers. It looked like the vacation was over. In a cafe in the middle of the city, young Sung Guy was waiting for Huimin Cha. She, of course, arrived complaining about his appearance, and asked if he chose such a busy place, just to keep her from attacking him. In return, he said he had left his own house to meet her, so he was the one at a disadvantage, since he couldn't activate the sin invasion. She sat down and got straight to the point, asking what they were going to do about that streamer's invitation. Besides regular people, other creators like them had probably also seen the video. Possibly 1 or 2 players were definitely going to show up. So what would be the best strategy? Young Sung Guy thought about what to do. He didn't want her to discover the true activation condition of his sin. He decided to say he would go. Even though his sin wasn't very effective, it would still be a good chance to discover other players' identities. That actually wasn't a bad idea. They just needed to check the location as soon as the address was posted in the comments. But before they could continue, something unexpected happened. Detective Park Sang-sik arrived at the cafe along with his demon. Gargamin Yum Sung Guy wondered why he had shown up there, and Hu Min-che turned around, coming face to face with another player. The detective smiled at them both, and said he found it cute that they were sitting in a public place, discussing what to do for a second. Both young players felt a wave of panic and exchanged glances, but it seemed the detective was being friendly. Even so, it was natural to wonder how long had he been watching them, and how did he have the guts to show up. even without knowing their sins. Had they done something that might have triggered his key's condition to send them to hell, they both wondered. Park Sang-sik finished the drink that used to be Yum Sung-ji's and told them to stop whatever it was they were thinking of doing. He warned them that if they continued, both of them would end up in hell right then and there. Meanwhile, at streamer Gaga's house, he checked the reach of his video and whether he had written the address correctly. Now all he had to do was post it and wait. His demon, Jin Zhang, asked if they were really going to go through with that plan. The boy smiled and, very excited, confirmed that they were definitely going to follow through with it. After all, he had already placed the cameras in their proper positions. Besides, Jin Zhang's ability wasn't useful for much else, and so the first major event in that game of death was set into motion, and Gaga's strategy preparation was complete. At the cafe, the three remained seated motionless. His key was glowing, which meant someone had committed the sin that activates his power. But when could that have happened? Since the announcement in that video about the games, he had tried not to commit a single sin. Yoon Song-gai remembered a detail at the police station. His key wasn't activated when he showed it, so could it have been reacting to Hu Min-cha and not him? He looked at the woman in front of him, when suddenly a hypothesis formed in his mind. Yoon Sung-ji tried to get Hu Min-cha's attention, but he was interrupted by Park Sang-sik, who seemed to have something to say. Even so, he stood up. The detective gave the boy one last warning, but Yom Sung-gai said he was bluffing. If his theory was correct, the detective had threatened someone to activate a sin, and used that moment to approach them, because if neither he nor Hu Min-cha had committed sins, the other could only be bluffing, and with a sinner in the cafe. All the pieces fit that explained why his key was active in that place. Besides, Yum Sung-gai hadn't seen him check his key at any point since entering the cafe. He noticed an obviously anxious man sitting nearby, and that bell on the table hadn't been there for long. Yim Sung-gae walked over to the man and went straight to the point, asking if he had entered the cafe, after being threatened by Park Sang-sik. Ominke stood up in outrage when she realized it had all been a setup, and our protagonist confirmed his hypothesis. "You think you would treat us like that?" the girl complained. The man who had been used took the opportunity to confirm with the detective, and rushed out of the place. Park Sang-sik gave a faint smile which startled Yum Sung-gai. The detective said the boy had really grown, or maybe last time they'd met, he had been so overwhelmed that he let something slip. What could that guy be planning? But then he stood up and told them it had all been a test. After all, he didn't want to ally himself with two idiots. Even so, Young Sung-gai didn't let it go and remained suspicious of him, but in a friendly tone, he asked the two young people to sit back down and hear his proposal, as if there were no tension at all between them. Now the detective was drinking from human chase coffee, making it all seem like the most normal thing in the world. She asked the nerd if they were really going to listen to what the detective had to say. After all, they didn't have much time. But the reason Yun Sung-gai hadn't stood up and left was precisely because that guy was a detective. Because of that, he had the ability to find hell creators like the two of them through police case records. Besides, there was still the possibility of him forcibly detaining or restricting someone using his public authority. In short, players like them who only had one card to play were at a disadvantage against the detective because he had two. So forming an alliance with him would be a good move, and considering the battle to come, having one more brain on the team would be an advantage. Yim Sung-ji made his move and said he'd agree to an alliance if the detective revealed what his sin was. Well, asking for his sin like that wasn't something he could just hand over on a silver platter. Humincha commented that forming an alliance without knowing each other's sins wasn't a good idea, but the detective went on saying that instead of revealing his sin, he had some excellent information to share with them. Like it or not, both were interested in the offer. The detective continued his speech by asking if the number of people they had sent to hell was still in the single digits, because so far he had sent 117 people to hell. As expected, Yum Sung-gai and Hu Min-chae were shocked by that information, but they ended up disturbing the other people in the cafe and apologized for the exaggerated reaction. So having sent so many people to hell, he had managed to gather some information about how key activation works, like how long the key stays active, how far the person can be, and even how many people they can send at once. And the more people he captured, the more information he managed to gather. So the proposal was that he would share that information with the two of them in exchange for forming an alliance during the battle that was going to take place that night. Obviously the two end up accepting the proposal and make their exit. Gargamel reappears questioning whether Park Sang-sik hadn't given away too much information for an alliance, considering how hard he had worked to get it. But he says the demon shouldn't worry, because the notebook he lent them had some important numbers switched, and if they ever betrayed him, Park Sang-sik would be able to devour both of them at once. At night, in a park in the middle of the city, Yong Sung-gae and Kyu Min-cho wait for the announcement of the Gaga's location, with 3 hours and 20 minutes remaining until the official release. But while they waited, it was a good time to start thinking about their teamwork. He calls Hui Min-che's attention and says he has a few questions to ask about her. His ability, could she use it now? Because if they identify Gaga's location first, they might gain some advantage before the other participants arrive. In response, Hui Min-che picks up a stick and starts drawing on the ground. As she explains, her demon's ability is to locate the nearest demon to them. In other words, she could only track the demon of the closest player within a certain range, so that night, she had come to him because he was the nearest player within her ability's radius. He asks how often she can activate her power, and she says it's every 12 hours. For 5 minutes, since she knew he would be home the whole time, she likely used her ability every 12 hours. While moving through the city, most likely since the day they met, she hadn't made contact with any other players out of caution, due to the fight they had. So Yong Sung-gae concludes that there were more people she had tracked, but hadn't told him about. She wanted to keep that information to herself, but during the cafe incident, he had saved her. Therefore, it was only fair to repay the favor. Hui Min-che takes a deep breath and then exhales. Her hunt had produced 2 results. One of them was at the immigration gate at the airport, and the other was inside the meeting room of TS Corporation. In other words, one of the players was probably a foreigner, and the other held a high-ranking position in the TS conglomerate. Unfortunately, neither of them looked into a mirror during the 5 minutes she had, so she didn't know what they looked like. Just to be clear, she said she hadn't mentioned it earlier, not because she didn't trust him, but because she had genuinely forgotten. She definitely didn't want to break the alliance. He thanks her and says that to strengthen their trust, he would explain a bit more about his abilities. What Baphomet could do was track the essence of death. In his case, it alerted him when someone wanted to kill, so if used properly it could predict the future. That wasn't a bad ability at all, especially combined with the sin of his ki. Hui Min-che comments, well, now that they knew each other a bit more, and there were still 3 hours left until the official release, it was best to separate so they could rest before the battle. She agrees, and Yong Sung-gae says he'll send a photo of the detective's notebook so she can study it too. He raises his hand for a friendly high five and tells her to survive. After all, just like him, she wouldn't want her prisoners to have an easy death. That makes her remember why her sin's theme was lust. In a room, a cell phone is set up with a camera on resting on a desk. A young man appears on the screen, and Hui Min-che in the background asks why the camera is on. He says it would be fun because of the adrenaline, and asks her to do it just this once for him. The next day at her school, 2 guys suddenly start hunting her down. Inside her locker, several slurs have been written. It was easy to understand what had really happened from there. A man rubs his hands together. Standing before Hui Min-che is her ex, apologizing and begging for mercy, but she says it was far too late. The damage was done and her family had been destroyed because of him. Hui Min-che returns to reality and agrees that Yong Sung-gae was right. She couldn't let the people in her hell die so easily. To give each other a friendly high five and say they will survive until the end. Yong Sung-gae was analyzing the notebook the detective had given him and making some notes when suddenly Baphomet appeared in his room. He begged the human to stop making him walk so much because his feet were hurting. After all, he was only used to moving through portals. In response, Yong Sung-gae told him to stop whining, since other creators could also see demons, so Baphomet had to stay hidden to avoid being easily found, considering how cautious he was being. The demon commented, wasn't he trusting Sadia's partner a bit too much? He said he didn't see a problem since he had lied about his real sin. Besides that, he needed her power for the battle. It was definitely going to be a numbers game. And other demons had probably formed alliances too. Somewhere in the city, Lam and 2 other demons were walking around, which proved Yoon Sung-gae's theory right. Those 3 were Lam Bamfer and Gordon Kilius. However, the alliance between them was different from the team of Yoon Sung-gae, Hu Min-cha and Park Sang-sik. Yoon Ning-han was clearly the leader of the 3, and treated the other 2, and Yun Hai and John Jong-chul as his subordinates. He seemed to be constantly refreshing Gagok's video feed. And finally the address was posted. Uni-han called out to John Jong-chul, tossed a key into his hands, and ordered him to drive them to the location. He also told the girl who was kneeling that she would be the first to enter the place. Kagaka had sent them to, and Enhei asked why she had to go first. But before she could keep talking, he showed her the glowing key, and said it was because she was incompetent, and her life belonged to him. She was clearly uncomfortable with that threat. It was awful to have to follow orders from a bastard like him. Jun Jong-chul asked if they would be free after completing the task, and Yu Ningen replied that he'd release them anytime, as long as they became useful people, so they didn't need to worry that way. The participants were now heading toward the place Kagaka had posted. Let the games begin. The city looked peaceful at night, without the bustle of people passing through the streets, like during the day. Yum Sung Ji's group was now gathered near a parking lot. They were discussing the information written in the notebook the detective had given them. It seemed they could only drag up to 5 people at a time into Hell. When the Hell Gate closes, it has a 1-minute cooldown before it can be opened again. The maximum distance between the gate and the center is 10 meters, even if the target is visible. If it's not within range, they won't be dragged in. Huaminsha commented that he had forgotten one detail. Even if the key recognizes someone as a sinner, if the creator doesn't acknowledge that person's sin, they won't be dragged in. In other words, there were 2 conditions for the gate to work. The target must sin and the creator must recognize them as a sinner. It seemed they had studied thoroughly. So the team's first goal was to spot and identify the other players. Second, gather clues about the other's sins. And third, all 3 had to survive. No matter the urge to reduce player numbers, they had to make it out alive. Human K asked about not taking risks to thin out the players, but Park Sang-sik replied that there was no reward for dragging other players into hell, so it wasn't worth the risk. However, if any opportunity allowed them to take someone out, they would do whatever was within their reach. He handed 2 walkie-talkies to the young pair. That way they could communicate better and warn each other if they spotted another user. In front of a luxury hotel, car pulled up. Ningen was trying to observe the enemy's movements using binoculars. Did they really have to be the first ones to enter? They didn't even know where the attack might come from. It was better to wait until other participants showed up and let them take the first risks. The boss was already getting irritated with all that whining. They had come there to try to reduce the number of players as much as possible, and as the 2 already knew, Yu Ning Han had already sent another player to hell. One thing he'd learned from that was that when you send a creator to hell, you gain an extra ability. 2 looked at him in disbelief. If that were true, getting an extra ability right at the start would be a huge advantage. The more cards you gather, the better your chances in the game. Soon those 2 subordinates came to the conclusion that if they managed to eliminate another player, they could then free themselves from Yuningen, or at least rise to the same level as him. As expected, the 2 of them fell for his trap like clueless fools. If there really were such a reward, the game organizer himself would have announced. He recalls the moment of his last battle. Right after the demon disappeared, he asked Lam if he had received any kind of bonus for that. Lam replied that he hadn't been informed of any new rules, nor felt any changes in that case. There was no need to kill other players with their own hands. They needed to rethink their strategy, and it was quite simple. He would use those 2 players as bait to be taken down by the new person who had emerged, and that way, he could gather information about the sin of the opponent's hell. With that, he could turn that new player into his slave, and repeat the process until the end of the game, and in the end kill his last slave to become the final winner. He gives a small cough to try and keep his expression under control, then continues his speech, saying everything he was doing was to make his allies stronger. Now they just needed to attach the cameras to their clothes and head out to battle. Meanwhile, Kagako was watching the security footage he had installed in strategic points. Suddenly 2 shadows form at his window. It opens and a woman enters. asking if the little kitty had been expecting her to ring the doorbell before coming in. It looked like she had used some sort of climbing rope. To make that entrance, her key was glowing, which meant they could attack. An Ion High raises the key and demands that the gates of the Hell of Vanity be opened. Several bats begin to appear around her. It was time for that brat to face his judgment. A giant bat positions itself, and when she turns the key, along with its wings, the portal opens. Hands reach toward Gagaka and restrain him, but suddenly they begin to retreat, surprising both the human and her demon. What could have happened? It made no sense that the key didn't work. Suddenly a deep voice begins coming from their target's direction, and an Ion High couldn't believe what she was seeing. They had completely targeted the wrong person. And as a mask is removed, another demon reveals itself. The two had no idea that was even possible, and before they could think of anything else, Gagaka's Hell of Invasion was activated. A green smoke began to fill the space, and bound by a rope, the girl and her demoness were dragged into Gaga's hell. Suddenly everything goes dark, and in a dance school a countdown can be heard. 3 girls are rehearsing. Carla looks at her phone, watching a different group of girls dancing, while wondering how long she would remain a trainee. Out of nowhere, from the other side of the room, a commotion can be heard, and a guy announces that the girl beside him, named Yul, will be debuting. And An Hai was shocked by the announcement, and questioned why that girl was debuting before the others she had trained with. He responds that it was a decision made from above, and there was nothing he could do. So instead of complaining, why didn't she celebrate with the other girls, whether she wanted to or not? She was crushed by the news, and someone approached her with a tissue in hand. That someone was Yul. She thought the other girl was being compassionate about her pain, but in reality, Yul tells En and Hyde to try improving for the next evaluation. After all, she had been a trainee for 7 years. Maybe she really didn't have the talent, and perhaps it was time to give up being an idol, because she was getting too old for that. Yul revealed herself to be a true snake in that moment. In a convenience store under the rain, and Yoon Hai drank to drown her sorrows, while watching that damn girl debuting, because she had found out that Yul had slept with the company rep, and that's why she was chosen to debut. That same night a light began to shine in her room, and a woman clearly not human appeared before her. She had a proposal to make, and an Ion High didn't have the courage to refuse. But when she reached her target and tried to send him to hell, she discovered she couldn't do it. Just because he was an executive from an elite company didn't mean he was a benevolent guy, and that made all of her effort look like a pathetic joke. He goes on to say that compassion is for the incompetent. He had only shown confidence based on evidence. While she was being dragged away, she thought that maybe she herself had been complacent for believing she'd survive after trusting a guy like that, and so the terms had been fulfilled. The gate to hell was closed and an Ion High was eliminated. As soon as it all ended, the demoness responsible for her also began to dissolve. Gagaka appeared excited with that victory. After all, everything had just been a theory to try using Jinjiang's power in their favor. He was happy with the compliment, since his power was usually only used at parties to entertain other demons. Kagako was clearly very pleased and satisfied with the result, and could hardly wait to use it again. Jinjiang put his mask back on, and they got ready to deal with the next victim. Green light of the portal's activation could be seen through the window, and Yom Sung Ji took the chance to use the radio and alert everyone. That light had definitely come from one of the players' portals. At least one person had definitely been defeated. From that moment on, Yom Sung Ji began building his theories. After all, according to what was written in the detective's notebook, the player who had opened that portal and probably won the battle would have to wait at least 1 minute before being able to open it again. Should he use that moment to go in? Could he enter and leave within 1 minute without getting caught? But before he could continue, someone put a hand on his shoulder, which startled him. He thought it might be another enemy player. However, it was the detective, trying to stop him from going through with that idea, since doing anything without a plan in just 1 minute would be extremely difficult. So what should they do? Park Sang-sik said it was simple. He could just ask if everything was okay since he had heard a scream. Hyun Sung Ji tried to argue, but then he understood the detective was trying to enter Gagaka's room, using the excuse of being a detective and having received a report. Whoever had won the last battle would have trouble sending a detective to hell, because if that happened, Other police officers would probably show up and taken in as a suspect. So the roles of Sung, Guy and Hu Min-chae were to prevent other players from entering. He would find a way to deal with whoever was inside. So he headed toward the building. That detective didn't just have guts. He also knew how to think fast in situations like that. The reason they had been patient until then was exactly to wait for someone to start a battle, so they could have a chance to intervene. But that was making Sung Jai anxious. Before he got caught and defeated, will he be able to send that guy to hell? As expected, the first camera had vanished. The girl was gone, but now he knew the theme of the opponent's hell. He threw the tablet aside and said it was time for them to make a move. The elevator had arrived at the 7th floor. The Gaga's apartment floor. The detective stepped out and was immediately caught on the streamer's camera. He wondered if this was an easy target. It didn't seem like one of the residents. Park Sang-sik walked up to the door and rang the bell. The young man seemed excited by the idea. After all, the door was open, so the guy just had to come in. He went back to the closet and had his demon act properly. The Park Sang-sik kept knocking and said he was a detective, and had come because of a report. It had definitely been because of the earlier noises and light thought. Gagaka, that was truly a serious problem. And just as the detective had planned, the young man had exactly the line of reasoning he expected. If I send him to hell, I'll probably be arrested. And if I open the door, it'll buy time for other players to show up. Well, the sooner he dealt with this, the better. So he went to the door and asked what report the detective had received. He said it was nothing serious, just someone reporting that a woman had been heard screaming in the next room, and asked if they could talk for a moment. Meanwhile, young Sun-gae was watching from outside, wondering how he'd handled the task of preventing other players from entering the building. It was definitely easier said than done, but he had to find some way to stop them, so they could continue with the plan. He called Hui Min-cha on the radio, and asked if she had seen any unusual movement. She replied that she hadn't yet, and asked if everything was going well with the detective. Sun-gae says that he had gone to confront the streamer, and they needed to make sure no one else entered. Hu Min-chae replies that she'll stay alert, and he asks if she had already used her ability that day. She says she hadn't felt the need to use it until then, since she had been with Sun-gae all day. So he asks her to use her ability at that exact moment, because he had a hypothesis. What if her power wasn't tied to the nearest target, but to the nearest person in motion? So if she had the ability active and another player approach, her vision's target would likely shift. Hui Min-cha had never thought of using her power that way before. After all, in every moment she used it, there hadn't been more than one player in the area, in a way that would allow the target to change within 5 minutes. If his hypothesis was correct, they could distinguish players from ordinary people approaching the building. Because the streamer's building wasn't purely residential, someone could try to sneak in, disguised as a delivery person or even a resident. And if it worked, they'd be able to identify the opponent before being identified themselves, creating an opening for a surprise attack. She grabs the walkie-talkie and climbs down from the ledge, calling out to Sadie's right after it was time for them to take action as soon as the power was activated. She could see Sung Ji's hand, but just as his hypothesis predicted, her vision quickly began to change. She alerts Sung Ji that the two people approaching the building at that moment were also players. He asks if both of them are or just one, but since her vision keeps shifting, then it's likely both are. Now Sun-gae had a problem. If it were just one person could find a way to handle it, but two people made things complicated, because there was no way to craft a strategy where both would commit the sin of betrayal, and even if he could handle one, there was always the possibility he couldn't handle the second. He needed to stay calm. They still didn't know he was a hell creator, so he still had the element of surprise up his sleeve. As soon as he appears, the two start debating whether or not he's a player. Just as expected, they wanted to avoid involving ordinary people as much as possible. Meanwhile, Sun-gae wonders whether he should keep pretending to be a resident, because even if everything went wrong for the detective, he still had human shy. He recalls all the decisive moments in his life, and escaping had always been an act of complacency. But he was tired of running from things. The young man clenches his fist, lost in thought. He had obtained the key to hell, precisely to punish people. And once again he was thinking of fleeing. Liam Sung-gai remains still as the other two approach, and ends up making a decision. He extends his hand, and tells the two men that they shouldn't enter the building. Both look confused while they had stopped. What should he do now? His strategy was to keep talking, so the opponent wouldn't have time to think. It was like two strategists facing off. Yuning-han wonders if he was some ally of Bigaka. He hadn't noticed before but soon concludes that couldn't be the case. Since the streamer's hell was the hell of invasion, there was no reason for him to stop them there. So maybe he was from another group of opponents. However, that theory was also unclear. Assuming that guy was a player didn't quite match his actions. But if he wasn't a player, why was he stopping them from going in then? He says they were conducting a building check. Due to a report they received about a woman screaming on the 7th floor. Yuning-han is outraged. He hadn't considered the possibility of a neighbor's report. The circumstances fit. Someone had probably reported it after hearing on and high scream before being sent to hell. So local detectives had to secure the area. But that theory, if true, opened two distinct possibilities. Yuning-han stares at Yong Sung-ji suspiciously. After all, the young man didn't look anything like a detective. Too skinny. And that sweat dripping down his face was way too suspicious. However, before suspicions could turn into conclusions, Yum Sung-gai decides to take a bold step. After all, a liar has to believe in their own lie. The businessman tries to speak with the detective's supposed assistant, but before he can continue, Yum Sung-gai grabs a radio and reports the situation from downstairs. While he was talking to Gagapa, Park Sang-sik suddenly heard Yum Sung-ji's voice over the radio, warning him that two residents were trying to enter. The kid had contacted him first. Probably meant it was a risky situation. It was time for them to make their exit. He replied saying he was already heading down. It seemed the source of the report was actually just live streaming, a horror game or something like that. The two were surprised to hear that what the kid had said was actually true. The protagonist really did know how to think quickly and strategically. When needed checkmate had been delivered. If his opponent couldn't keep up with him, they wouldn't be able to follow. He informed them that the building would be cleared soon, and asked the two to wait just a little longer. Park Sang-sik got out of the elevator, confirming that there had really been nothing wrong, and apologized for making the residents wait to enter. While putting away his police badge, he told them they could go in now. Yuningen thought that although he had been surprised, he still knew about Gagaka's hell, so he would move forward with his plan. He thanked the detective for his work, and commented that the neighborhood really had been a bit noisy lately. The two went to the elevator and entered the building. As soon as he exited, Park Sang-sik asked if those two were also creators, and how they had figured it out. Yim Sung-gai said it had been thanks to Hu Min-che's ability, and that those two were their enemies. He asked about the streamer, and the older man said that, unfortunately, he hadn't been able to send Gagaka to hell yet. However, thanks to the two young ones, they had managed to identify two more players. In total, 7 players had now been identified, one of them being the girl, who had been absorbed by the YouTuber's hell. That had been a really good result for just one night of work. From now on they could say the game had truly begun, and it was the first time so many players had come face to face, as planned. Their group had managed to gather the information they wanted. Meanwhile, someone rang a doorbell. It was Yuning-han, and he had a proposal to make to the streamer. The businessman suggested that Gagaga become his dog, and in response the boy asked if he was insane. From outside he said the person the other had killed was one of his dogs, and that as long as he didn't enter the invasion, hell couldn't be activated. His victorious smile was clear, while the young man inside hadn't expected that comment. If what that man had said was true, then what would he do if the streamer never left his house? The businessman answered that it was simple. Had post someone to watch day and night, and the moment he stepped outside, he would personally show up. And let's say he didn't leave his house. How long could he last with the supplies he had? Even if he managed without ordering delivery, he'd last maybe 2 months for at most. That brat had just signed his own prison sentence unexpectedly. Instead of submitting, Dagaka rebelled and decided not to leave. The lunatic shivered with excitement. It would be a pleasure to torture him until he came out, and then he decided to leave. Dagaka discussed his new strategy with his demon, but unlike the boy, the demon was a little more pessimistic, and asked if it was really worth buying time like that without solving the situation. But Kagaka answered saying that while time passed, someone else might end up sending that guy to hell. They just had to hold on a bit longer. But that method didn't last even a week. Every food delivery he ordered came with trash instead. And after reporting it to the police more than 3 times, they started thinking it was a prank. Soon after, someone cut the power, and the water in the apartments became contaminated. The anxiety of the enemy suddenly breaking in at any moment turned into insomnia, and when the freedom outside his apartment became more tempting than ever, a business card appeared under his door. "Get in touch if you've given up," it read, and with that, the streamer accepted his defeat. The day was sunny, and inside the office of the CEO of Kia's corporation, Yuningen was waiting for Kagaka. He had lasted longer than expected, but now he would be his little dog. Inside a factory in Korea, a man screamed for help as he ran desperately. A demon and his player were chasing him. The guy wearing a Friday the 13th Jason mask attacked, saying he had already given the man on the ground 2 choices. It was either go straight to hell or die by his hands. From inside his pocket he pulls out his key. The man in white panics either way. He loses the key, begins to glow, meaning the condition had been fulfilled. Well, since he didn't want to choose, the hell creator would choose for him. "It's time to go to hell," he says, while winking in a cute way. Slowly the portal begins to form grotesquely, and viscera wrap around the man and devour him all at once. He watches his demon approach and snuggles against him. It seems someone had a thing for dark romance. The Black Knight says he enjoys his humans' hobbies, but if they don't start hunting the other players soon, he'll have to punish him. He replies that he understands. He'll stop hunting humans and start hunting hell creators. It had been 10 days since the hunt began, and 5 days since the encounter with Kagaka. Young Sun Guy decided to start training, to prepare himself for a long battle. He was also taking care of his diet and sleep schedule. He and the detective began investigating the 2 guys who had shown up that night, and finally they had managed to gather some information about them. One of them was a director at Kia's corporation named Yuning Han, considered a genius who had earned that position at 31 years old. As for the other guy, they hadn't found much information, but one thing was clear: he wasn't an ordinary person. Besides, he was clearly a strategist, which made him a dangerous player. If they or someone else didn't eliminate that player soon, he would likely be capable of endangering the entire group. Park Sang-sik looks at Yim Sang-gae, thinking it made perfect sense. He not only had social status, but also a massive amount of money. If someone like that also had above-average intelligence, they were in serious trouble. The other player was named John Cho, and he was an architect, but nothing too unusual about him. He was probably being threatened by Ning Han, and maybe that was his way of forming alliances, because the last time the Blessing encountered that architect, he didn't say a single word voluntarily. He hesitated to say anything unless Nung Han gave permission. Well, maybe that piece of information could be useful. Perhaps they could find a way to break the alliance between the 2. Yum Sung Guy thanks the detective for the new information and says he's heading out. But Park Sang-sik notices that the young man had changed. It seemed like he had matured over time. He thanks him for the compliment and says his mental health was a bit better. At first he was still unsure how to live after completing his revenge, but now he didn't have to worry about that anymore. Back at his house, young Sun Guy says he feels relieved, but Baphomet questions that. After all, shouldn't he be reducing the number of opponents? In response, the young man says, "There's a human saying that victory or defeat is decided before the battle even begins. And in this case, the battle revolved around how much information you had about your opponent, and how much your opponent had about you. You couldn't move blindly, especially in a fight where the loser would go to hell for eternity. So it was better to prepare calmly and be ready for when the storm began." Baphomet asks about Humincha, and Yom Sung Guy replies that she's trying to track the opponents at least twice a day. Suddenly, his phone starts vibrating. He answers, and before he can say anything, she informs him that she's found a player. Yom Sung Guy asks where she saw him, and she says it was near Myeongdong Street. She was going to alert the detective, and maybe this would be a good opportunity to hunt them down. But Yim Sung Guy responds that the risk was too high. They should just gather physical details for now. But that wasn't a residential area. It was a commercial street, so there was nowhere for them to hide. Besides, she was hiding Sadia's, since the guy didn't know she was one of the players. It was the perfect chance to catch him off guard. He had no counter-argument for that. But even so, the risks were extremely high, especially because they didn't have any information about the other player. However, before he could say anything else, she hangs up. Hu Minche was already tired of just hunting and hiding. It would be easier to eliminate the other players right from the start. Suddenly her target started moving into an alley on that street. It was a perfect moment. He was definitely about to commit the sin of lust, thought Huimincha. She hid the key in her bag just in case, and as soon as she turned the corner, she was startled. Her prey was standing still, and when he turned around, his face was marked with several scars. His name was John, and Han. He clearly knew she had been following him, and even after seeing her, the key of lust had not activated. He lunged at her like a wild animal, and Huimincha was caught off guard. Back in an abandoned factory, Huimincha started to wake up, wondering where she was. A terrible headache began to throb. She remembered being caught by surprise by that man. He had probably used some kind of drug to knock her out and bring her there. She sighed. There was no one to blame but herself. Young Sun Guy had been right, and surely he and the detective were looking for her now. She tried to calm down and think about what she could do next. Her key, phone, and wallet. Everything had been stolen. Even if she couldn't contact the other two, getting the key back would be complicated. The wall where she was being held was made of concrete, and the door was iron. Escaping would be hard. At least she still had Sadia's to help her. She admitted they were in danger because of her, but they couldn't give in. They'd find a way to escape. Sadia started to cry, but she tried to stay positive. Even if she couldn't trust them 100%, she was sure the other two would find a way to save them. They'd worked together before, and her tracking ability was very important for building their game strategies. Sadia's gradually started to believe what she was saying. It felt a little better. She picked up a block of concrete. Someone would show up for sure. She just had to stay alive until then. And Park Sang-sik had been right. As soon as Yun Sung-ji could no longer contact her, he called the detective. He warned him about the girl's disappearance. There was a possibility she had already been sent to another player's help, but also a chance she had been kidnapped. Park Sang-sik's teenagers really were a handful, and it would be dangerous if his identity was exposed because of her disappearance. But her ability was indispensable to them, so the two of them got ready to start searching for her. Baphomet was thrilled. They were finally taking action, and it seemed that this time they were sure they were going to win. The key issue now was whether Huiminche would be able to hold on until they found her. With her neck in his hands, John in hand said that for a girl, she had held out pretty well. It would have been easier if she'd just given up from the start. Apparently the drug he used wasn't that effective on her. She called him a psychopath, a lunatic, and more. But those insults were to him the highest compliments. Meanwhile, Sadius and Black Knight were fighting too. But the fight for life was meant to be only between humans, and Black Knight's player had won. With that said, he threw Sadius far away according to Lucifer's rules. Demons weren't allowed to use powers beyond their own innate gift. The girl's demon tried to argue to buy time, but it was useless. John and Han was already making his next move. He hung her by her shirt on a hook and tied her hands and feet. Even then, Huiminche didn't lose hope. The man tried to understand what she was murmuring. She took advantage of his proximity, screamed in his ear, and then bit it just to try and stun him. John in hand flinched in pain, and she bit down even harder. But then something unexpected happened. He grabbed a sharp object and cut off his own ear. If Huiminche wanted it so badly, she could have it. And about her friends, he knew they were coming because he had seen her with the phone. While she was following him, a red liquid dripped onto the floor, and that was why he hadn't killed her yet or treated her like a doll, because Huiminshao was nothing more, nothing less than his precious bait. Because of those words, the girl's hope slowly turned into anxiety. She was afraid of becoming her own team's downfall. He started to hum, saying that the preparations were ready. Only the main course was missing. Meanwhile, young Sun Guy was heading to the location Hu Mincha had told him about earlier. He knew that given the number of people there and the time that had passed, finding his partner was nearly impossible. But the young man had an ace up his sleeve. He asks Baphomet to use his power to sniff out death. The demon says he'll show him, and releases a cloud of smoke in his direction. Slowly Yum Sung-ji's eyes begin to adjust to this new vision. The only route where he could be putting his life at risk was the one leading toward Huimincha. If his theory was correct, the denser the smoke became, the closer he was to the location. This time he could actually use that power to track them down. Baphomet observes him with a certain respect. Humans always manage to surprise demons, and in just a few minutes, he had managed to turn the power he was born with into something completely different, like tracking someone. That was incredible. Yim Sung Ji continued on his path, and as the sun began to set, he found the place where she was being held hostage. The first thing he does is grab his phone to send the location to the detective. Now the problem was figuring out how to get in. Someone pushes a cart toward Huimin Cha. She opens her eyes and sees various construction tools, like hammers and saws. If that lunatic was really inspired by movie serial killers, there was only one way to survive. She shouldn't let him take any pleasure in torturing her. For now she would keep pretending to be unconscious. Just as expected, he tries to wake her, but she stays limp. John in hand really didn't want to touch her unless she was awake, but he was getting so bored. Her partners were taking too long to arrive, so he wanted to have a little fun. In the meantime, he grabs her by the hair and says he knew she wasn't asleep. He didn't want to end her life, just torture her a bit. She closes her eyes, racing for the worst, but then a noise is heard outside. Siren sounds were getting closer to the location. Black Knight asks if he had left any clues behind, but the human responds that there was nothing to worry about. He had chosen him exactly because he did his job right, so there was no need for doubt. Maybe another player had found them and called the police, or one of the players was also a cop. Those were definitely the only two possibilities. They didn't need to worry, they just had to use Black Knight's ability. John in hand gives the activation command. The cars rushed as fast as they could. When they arrived, everyone prepared to enter. It seemed the person who gave the tip didn't want to show up, out of concern for their own safety. After all, that young man was cautious and shy. Just tracking the place had been enough. Now it was time for the adults to back. It was an abandoned factory, but it looked like someone had built a structure inside, resembling a haunted house. They needed to search every corner of the place. From what had been reported, a woman had been dragged there, and finding her before anything worse happened was the goal. Everything seemed to be going well, but why was Baphomet's power growing stronger? One of the officers walked through the building. Walking between those windowless walls was terrifying. He saw a silhouette, but it quickly disappeared. Claws stretch out from behind the officer, and moments later, he meets his end just like in a horror movie. Black Knight had made his first move, and now inside the armor was John and Han, thrilled to have pulled it off with his own hands. The demon tells him to focus. His ability consumed his life. If he stayed in the armor too long, they wouldn't be able to keep playing. The human gets even more excited. He wanted to go after the others right away. The detective was also walking through the place. Something definitely felt off about that structure, which resembled the labyrinth. No matter how badly he wanted to find the girl, this was clearly a trap. He alerts the others over the radio, telling them to fall back. The structure was more complex than he had thought. They were going to need reinforcements, but no one responded to his message. Park Sang-sik begins to panic at the radio silence. Something was coming toward him. He could feel the presence of death approaching more and more. As a good officer, he prepared himself for what was about to come. Suddenly, from his side, the armor appears. He notices it and manages to dodge the attack. The opponent gets excited by that. He shoots, but the armor doesn't even get scratched. What the hell was that? Was it a human? A demon? He was confused. The armor attacks again, and he dodges with no better idea. He asks his demon what the hell that thing is, and he answered that it was the demon Black Knight. The detective questioned him about it while continuing to attack. As far as he knew, participating demons weren't allowed to attack humans, but Gargamon said that was his ability, and told him to take a closer look. You could see a human face inside the demon's helmet. Damn it, those two were taking advantage of the loose interpretation of the rules. To attack, he dropped his weapon to the ground. Human or not, to survive, he would have to fight. Meanwhile, his opponent was enjoying himself more and more. The young sunny guy started to worry about the delay and the noises he was hearing from inside. Suddenly the detective came flying out of the factory's side door. The combined power of the demon and human was far more than he could handle. The young man was shocked by what he saw. Both the human and his armor approached the detective. His intuition was sharp, and he asked if someone else was lurking around. If they didn't show themselves soon, he would open the portals and swallow the detective. Hearing that Yum Sung-gae felt there might still be a chance, Park Sang-sik smiled faintly as he remembered his father. Wearing the Korean police uniform, his family lived together in a humble but well-kept house. A news report about a criminal's arrest was playing on TV, and Park Sang-sik watched it as if hypnotized. Out of nowhere, his mother smacked his head with a spoon, asking if he wasn't tired of watching that. But the boy replied that seeing that kind of news inspired him. His father would come home in the late afternoon, always bringing treats for him and his little brother. He always made a point of telling the most interesting stories from work, but one day it wasn't him who came back. It was his co-workers bringing the news. It seemed that while investigating a criminal organization, he got caught. The man who had seemed invincible, who had even survived a stabbing before, lost his life due to the damage from multiple kicks, and the people responsible were too many for the main culprit to be identified. On the news, the report about the fallen officer was covered up, so people wouldn't lose faith in the police. Staring at the TV in disbelief, he realized how unjust society could be. Angrily, he threw the remote on the floor and snapped. He decided to become a detective, specifically to bring justice to his father. But sometimes evil ends up winning, all because of the loopholes in the law and backdoor deals driven by personal interest. Sometimes the ones responsible for enforcing justice stank worse than the criminals. Park Sang-sik hadn't become a detective just for his father, but to carry his father's will and try to end those injustices. Someone needed to clean up that mess. He wanted to offer justice to the weak, so he gave 100% of himself to his work. One day something abnormal appeared before him. It was his chance to deliver justice with his own hands. Back to reality, the detective had been hit hard and thrown far. John in hand was enjoying that raw power more and more. He was barely standing but still trying to stay in the fight. He couldn't lose like that. There were still many injustices he needed to judge. He pulled his key from his pocket and tried to open his hell, but his opponent grabbed his hand, saying that if he couldn't turn it, he couldn't open it. Even so, Park Sang-sik kept trying but was soon knocked out again. As soon as his key hit the ground, John in hand kicked it far away. Gargamel said he couldn't intervene, but still pointed out how unfair that fight was. His opponent asked how he expected the fight to be, because as he saw it, no matter how many strategies the detective came up with, society hadn't evolved enough. Nothing was more pleasurable than being a predator, one who can simply dominate and devour its prey. In other words, no matter how smart the rabbit is, can't stop the leopard. He prepared to deliver the finishing blow. When another person drew his attention, John in hand stared at Yum Sung-gae, wondering what that other rabbit was doing there. The detective also stared back at him, internally thankful that he had shown up. That psychopath wondered why so many creators had appeared at once. Meanwhile, the young man tried to stay calm, but his legs were trembling like leaves in the wind. Park Sang-sik hoped his ally had come up with a plan. Otherwise they were screwed. The brute let go of his former prey, now focusing on the newcomer. He got ready. His opponent was a brute. He needed to play with his pride. And as expected, John in hand falls right into his trap. Yum Sung-ji keeps his tough guy stance and calls him to a fight. The enemy heads toward him, getting closer and closer. When he's nearly there, the protagonist asks Baphomet to show him the scent of death at the lowest possible intensity. That's when he knew the fight was already won, holding back until the last second. When his opponent throws the punch, he dodges. John in hand realizes that guy managed to dodge a strike that not even the detective could avoid. He smiles, certain he would come out victorious. When he heard about Baphomet's power, he knew that with a bit of logic, it could be turned into a very powerful ability. One of its uses was to predict what the opponent would do, and which path could be used to escape death. And in this case, since it was a physical attack, it became easier to dodge. In other words, by knowing exactly when, he had a 100% chance of ending up 6 feet under. He could dodge attacks with precision. Little by little, John in hand grows confused about why he isn't able to catch his prey. And in his mind, Black Knight warns him that the more he moved, the more his life dropped. He needed to land the final blow quickly. Meanwhile, Yum Sung-gae was silently thankful for his morning training. His stamina was great. He could keep up that speed for a while longer. He keeps dodging, forcing him to move even more confident in his victory. He keeps toying with his opponent's mind, His reflexes and physical condition had really improved. He hops back a few times, but Baphomet warns him about the time. They needed to find a way for the brute to commit betrayal. But Yun Song-gai refuses the suggestion. He had partners, and while he held the opponent's attention, Park Sang-suk was slowly moving toward the key. If he could grab the key in time, they could secure victory. That way of thinking was genius. What if John in hand noticed the detective's presence again? Baphomet wondered, as if he had heard it. He starts wondering why that little bunny was provoking him and running around all the time, and then it hits him as he turns. He sees Park Sang-sik with his hand almost on the key, but still not close enough to grab it. He gets furious with the situation. How dare those two mess with him like that? Without thinking twice, he rushes toward the detective, who spends his last bits of energy to reach the key. Park Sang-sik finally grabs it and aims at his target. It was time for someone to be sent to hell. He turns the key and the door opens. Slowly the chains begin wrapping around John and Han, and start dragging him inside. But before he could fall into the hell of injustice, he grips the ground, shocking everyone. He knew he deserved to go to hell for everything he'd done, but there were still many things he wanted to witness in that world. In the red light district, several people walked down the street. A boy had been born and raised in that place. It definitely wasn't an easy life. Especially for a child. He spots a beautiful woman smoking. A man seemed to be approaching her. His name was Inguk. With no warning, he slaps the girl and tells her not to call him by his name like that. Because of his twisted and violent childhood, he took pleasure in reenacting the pain he endured, starting with street rats and gradually moving on to people. From behind, Yun Sung-gi comes in with a flying kick. He said he didn't care about the guy's serial killer past. Upon landing the kick, John in hand breaks free from the ground and is properly swallowed by the hell of injustice. Somehow the fight was over and they had come out as the winners. The detective was beginning to feel the pain more, now that the adrenaline was wearing off. Yim Sung-dae approaches and extends a hand to him, saying they needed to free Hu Min-cha. He jokes a bit with Yim Sung-dae. It wasn't like him to act all friendly like that. The old man was tired. He joked that his nephew needed to carry him now. The winners of that round were Yum Sung-gai and Park Sang-sik, strengthening their alliance. Still tied up inside the factory, the doors finally open and light pours in. They had really come for her. They took a beating, but they managed to achieve the objective. Sung-gae grabs a shard of glass and begins cutting her loose. As soon as she's freed, her legs give out and she falls into his lap. She always acted like she was strong, but now she was crying like a child. Having felt death at her doorstep was terrifying. He gave Hu Min-cha time to let her emotions out. Park Sang-sik, he had sent that brute to hell. There was nothing to fear anymore. Gradually the medical team arrived and everything was arranged, so it looked like the detective had rescued a kidnapped girl. Meanwhile, our protagonist hid in the shadows and left without leaving a trace. Killer had escaped and was being hunted, and with that the case seemed to be closed. But the news report on TV about the case caught the attention of a certain businessman. Little by little he started connecting the dots. That guy had appeared during the Gakka's battle, and now again in this case. There was a possibility that the detective was also a creator of hells. To the world, the culprit had fled and was on the run. But what if he was actually inside the detective's hell? Yumin Han decided to make a call to the CEO. He asked his boss to open an investigation into Park Sang-sik, under the excuse that he wanted to express his respect and gratitude for the rescue. Soon, he would find out if his suspicions about that officer were correct. At the hospital in the morning, Yum Sung-gai was reviewing some documents while Hu Min-cha slept. Little by little, she started waking up and found a young man in front of her. He teased her, saying the brat had finally woken up. Without thinking twice, she jumped into his arms, knocking everything to the floor. Liam Sung-gi was flustered by the sudden contact, but when he saw her crying, his expression changed. For a man, he was doing quite well. Embarrassed, he stood up and placed Hui Min-cha back on the bed. For now, she needed to calm down and rest. Meanwhile, he would let the detective know she had woken up. But before leaving, he had to hand her a few documents. It was the research on their other two opponents. He had wanted to give it to her earlier, but due to the incident only managed now. Before leaving, Yum Sung-gai asked Hu Min-cha to read everything carefully, and told her to take care of herself. When he arrived at the detective's room, he jokingly said he was hurt that he went to see Hu Min-cha first. A grown man jealous imagined that As they continued talking, the detective reached into his pocket and handed a key to Yum Sung-gae. After everything that had happened, it was clear that tracking other creators of hell wasn't going to be easy. Guys like that serial killer wouldn't stop for anything. And as the game went on, the danger would only grow. That was a copy of the key to Park Sang-sik's house. Even if their opponents were crazy, I probably wouldn't dare invade a detective's house. So it was safer there. Yim Sung-gae agreed with that logic. In the end, having an adult to rely on wasn't a bad thing. He said he would move in as soon as he finished sorting out some things at home. But Park Sang-sik had one more thing to give him. He grabbed a notebook and handed it to Yom Sung-gae. That notebook contained the correct information and numbers, unlike the one he had given earlier. When they formed the alliance for a moment, Yom Sung-gae's whole world shattered, because that man's action could be considered a betrayal. If that triggered his key, it would be the perfect chance to eliminate him, because that detective by the end of the game would definitely be a formidable enemy. All his abilities were top tier, and based on their past battles, he would surely be the final opponent. What should Yun Sung-gae do? He wondered now that he had confirmed the crime. Should he save it for later or eliminate him now? Sensing that the boy seemed off, he asked if Yum Sung-gae was feeling unwell. Yum Sung-gae dodged the question and said he just needed to use the bathroom. As expected, his keys were glowing. Baphomet appeared and commented precisely on the change in the notebook's information and how much it could have put them at risk. As a result, the sin of betrayal had been committed, so it was the perfect time to finish off the detective for good, because he not only had a powerful ability, also knew too much about them. The next time he betrayed them, it would probably be at a moment when Yoon Sung-jae would end up stepping into his hell. The young man gripped his key tightly. When the demon had given him the chance to create his hell, he chose betrayal because it was the sin he hated the most. But if he betrayed Park Sang-sik now, he would never forgive himself for being no different from the ones he had condemned to suffer. Thinking further ahead, what if when he grows old and dies, this betrayal becomes his karma, sending him to his own hell? In that case, he would have to see the faces of everyone he hated all over again, and that was the last thing he wanted. Baphomet listens and says that when he first met him, he wanted him to use his inferiority complex, his negative thoughts and his anger to create the perfect hell. But the more he got close to those two humans, the more he felt that Yun Sung-gae was becoming a completely different person. Human relationships and their attachments don't interest me, but if at any moment Yun Sung-gae's choices threaten both of their lives, then Baphomet would make him regret ever making that decision. The young man agrees to the conditions, but was sure he wouldn't let the demon regret it. Back in the detective's room, the three end up gathering and chatting for a while longer. Suddenly a man approaches, and it's none other than Yu Ning-han. He had gotten the information he wanted and decided to make his official appearance. After talking for a long time, Hyun Min-chae decides to return to her room to rest a bit more in the hallway. Without knowing who the other was, the two hell creators end up crossing paths. Hyun Min-han enters the room acting all friendly, saying he was happy to see them again. But that instantly puts both Hyun Sung-gae and Park Sang-sik on alert. Dropping the act, he asks if the two were joining forces or planning to send him to hell. The young man becomes slightly wary, but the older one steps forward, feigning ignorance. Park Sang-sik says he has no idea what he's talking about and asks how he got access to such a private room. In response, the businessman comments that the detective's acting deserved a Nobel Prize. Right then they knew there was nowhere left to run. Yoon Min-han continues his speech, saying that officially, he was there just to congratulate a police officer who heroically saved a girl from a serial killer. But in truth, what he really wanted was to propose an alliance to the two of them. Young Sung-gae is caught off guard by that proposal, but what he wondered the most was how that guy had managed to track them down. Had he made a mistake that night, or had he left some trace the day they saved Human Cha? The businessman notices the boy's curiosity about how he figured things out. He says it hadn't been that hard. After all, a detective who always stood out and a kid who looked way too young to be his partner were bound to attract attention. To top it off, Yoon Ning-han had asked his secretary to dig into their lives a bit, and that's when he discovered that Yoon Sung-gae was just a student. He puts the fruit basket on the table and says that made him wonder why a renowned detective was getting involved in matters outside his jurisdiction, especially dragging a mere student along. That's how he came to the conclusion that the two of them were probably hell creators and had formed a temporary alliance during the Gagaka battle. And in the serial killer case, the two fought together because their opponents were also players. With that said, he didn't need to explain further why he had come to that conclusion. What should they do now? Should they admit it? Or maybe the detective had another idea to escape this situation. Park Sang-sik smirks and mocks the enemy, asking what exactly he expected the two of them to say after all that. That reaction catches the other two off guard. But before anyone can say anything else, he asks what Yuning-han really wanted in the end. Should they kneel and beg to be his servants like John Child did? Or was that not necessary? It looked like the businessman had finally found a player on his level, someone who also had information about his life and his moves. Yuning-han says that wouldn't be necessary. He wouldn't have wasted his own time. If that was his goal, he probably would have just sent one of his lackeys. As he already said, what he really wanted was a very strong alliance with the two of them. But Park Sang-sik immediately refuses. He already had a strong alliance with the architect, and had probably recruited the streamer too. It was time to reveal the truth about what the spoiled brat really wanted. He gives a sideways smile and drops a piece of information neither of them expected. It looked like Jun Chil had disappeared, and the businessman didn't know whether he was dead, in hell or just in prison somewhere. So he wanted to catch the one responsible. He wanted to find the person who had managed to move around him without being seen. Without a doubt, whoever pulled that off had to be one of the most dangerous players among them, he said as he extended his hand. Yuningen didn't want to make empty or pointless offers, just wanted them to work together until they found the one responsible for the architect's disappearance. And in that moment Yun Sung Ji made his decision. That businessman was a dangerous player. Sending him to the hell of betrayal wouldn't be easy. After all, his hell had a limit, but there was a way to handle it. He extended his hand and the two shook hands. Yom Sun Ji would accept the alliance, and eventually make that guy betray him. In an abandoned building, the architect was tied to a chair. Someone approached him. It was a girl who until then seemed harmless. Her name was Cha Mu-jin. As soon as she arrived, the two brutes beside him bowed in respect. The girl ordered them to remove the tape from the man's mouth and make him talk. John Chil started cursing and asking who they were and why they were doing that. Ignoring him, Shamujin asked what his crime was and started a countdown. Because he said nothing by the end of it, she ordered her demon to deal with him. The architect asked if they could just talk. But things weren't that simple. His finger was bent backward and the man screamed in pain. Meanwhile, she asked again what his crime was. In desperation, Jun Chul said he would tell her everything. Whatever she wanted to ask, he would answer in response. She ordered them to break another one. As the architect arrived in agony, she calmly said she wanted a concise and clear answer, then asked again what his crime was. And the man replied that it was the crime of negligence. Cha Mu-jin asked if he knew the hell of any other player trying to bear the pain, he said capable. But since it wasn't a clear answer, she ordered them to break another one to stop them. He started shouting that that was the name of one of the players. But even so, he was punished. The sound of a printer could be heard in the silence that now filled the room. If he meant to say it was a person, he should have clearly said the name from the start. The man kept complaining that he had already said he would cooperate. There was no need for that. She examined the information she had gathered about Yuning-han. Also known as capable, he seemed like a smart and well-connected guy. But that didn't matter. She would find a way to drag him to hell with that. She ordered two of her partners to come closer and said it was time for them to get ready. Meanwhile, still at the hospital, Yuning-han said he didn't know any details about the person who had kidnapped Jung Chul, which made any investigation difficult. But there was one thing he was sure of. If John Chil had let any information about him slip to the enemy, they would surely gather to try to ambush him. He asked if his men were ready and everyone responded yes. It was at that moment of the ambush that the businessman wanted to capture the other player. That was the goal of their alliance 12 years ago. In a parking garage, executions were being carried out under the orders of a boss. Someone still tried to hold on to the honor of their gang, saying those rats couldn't show up like that and expect to walk away unpunished. but they didn't let him keep talking and hit him square on, continuing the beatings until he finally went silent. They knew the risk of being there, and they had come precisely to settle the score. If you had stayed quiet and not fought back, maybe you'd have gotten away with just a few slaps, said the leader of the rival gang named Kim Jong-soo. Suddenly 3 imported cars pulled into the garage, and armed men stepped out of each one. Chaemun-jong, the leader of the Chesabang gang, had arrived. Kim Jong-soo greeted him with the utmost casualness. One of the subordinates was irritated by the audacity of that man, but the boss stayed calm and asked what the other wanted. He smiled. It was pointless to pretend he didn't know why they were there. They had unfinished business. After all, a wheelchair approached, and a vegetative young man named Cho Sun-rak appeared. He was once one of the heads of the Jono gang. Look at the state he was in now. He had taken such a brutal beating that they weren't even sure if he'd be able to walk again. Either way, Kim Jong-soo asks how the leader of Kizyo Bang was going to pay for that. Another guy replies that it was Cho Sung-rak's own fault. If he hadn't meddled in their territory, that wouldn't have happened. But before he could say more, their own boss silences him with a slap. He more than anyone knew the situation. There was no need for them to speak out of turn like that. Well, if Chong Mun-jong understood the situation, then that meant the old man was ready to pay for the damages. 2 suitcases are thrown at his feet, and the bold one says, all he had to do was fill them both with dollars and share the profits from his territory with them. That way the resources of the Chai Subin gang would belong to them, and they'd be able to grow faster. It was a shame the son of their boss ended up like that. So what was the old man waiting for? It was time to fill the bags, or they might as well just declare war already. Cha Mun-jong asks his subordinate to bring his daughter, and so he does, bringing the little girl out of the car. She was only 7 at the time. Kim Jong-soo asks what the hell he was thinking, trying to use sympathy against gangsters. He gently caresses his daughter and says that the man in front of him had a debt to settle with him, and in that case she would have to pay. In his place, the old man pulls a sharp object from inside his coat. His enemy had said the son of his boss would never walk again. So if he did the same to his daughter, then they'd be even before anyone could say anything else. He slashes both of the girl's Achilles tendons. Everyone was in utter disbelief over what had just happened. No one expected that kind of twist. There were men there who had been gangsters for over 20 years and had never seen a father destroy his own daughter's health before. That had clearly crossed every possible line. While the girl struggles with the pain, her father caresses her again and says he owes her a great debt for that, and he would make sure to repay her. An object falls to the ground and a man picks it up. Several gangsters were lying defeated around him. Strangely, black smoke was coming out of their mouths. Noses and ears. Sitting in her chair amid the chaos was Cha Mu-jin. The demon asks if he should finish the job for her, but the young woman replies no. She wanted to collect her debt herself. He just needed to push her chair in the main hall. Her father trembles, and when the door opens, he knows his time has come. His daughter had finally gained enough power to come and collect what he owed. In desperation, he begs her not to come closer. But it's useless. Cha Mu-jin turns the key and a hell opens, taking her father's body and soul with it. That was how she made her exit after finally having her debt repaid. If the businessman ruled the light, Cha Mu-jin ruled the shadows. Unlike Unning Han and his subordinates, who could commit illegal acts without getting caught, thanks to their corporate power, the gang under her command committed crimes in her name, so they wouldn't be sent to hell. One of her subordinates hands her a copy of the businessman's schedule. She's praised for doing a good job. Now what were they going to do about that architect? He begs for mercy. He had handed over everything that was asked, and like it or not, he was also being used by you didn't hand. She approaches him and, looking him deep in the eyes, says she'd let him go, but he would owe her one because she was sparing him, even though she could have taken his life right there. John Cole accepts the terms. A debt was better than losing his life. So the gangster says to let the guy go still had some value left. She glances once more at the businessman's schedule and sees that the charity party would take place in 2 days. Perfect time for an ambush. Cha Mu-jin commands her men to gather as many people as possible. The day had come and everyone was assembled. She asks if the men were ready, and they all answer yes. It was time to begin the mission. They all moved toward their respective cars in a distant mansion. The party had already started. and Yuning Han was chatting with various important people. Suddenly he spots his most anticipated guest, Yum Sung Guy in Park. Sang-sik had been invited to the party to act as his lifeguards, but that wasn't exactly what they wanted. The detective said he was only there for the food. It was the boy who had accepted the alliance, not him. Young Sung Guy told him to stop being dramatic, and then asked the businessman if he was sure the target would show up that night, and he replied that he was certain because, unlike corporate buildings, that place had easy access and little security, which made it easier for someone to blend in among the guests, so surely they would come straight into his trap. Another Hell creator was heading toward the party. The game was about to begin again. At the mansion rented by the businessman, the party was in full swing. From a distance, Chong Mujin watched the movement of the police through binoculars. Even with such a high-profile event, security didn't seem all that great. Even the rookies who worked for her could have done better. What should we do then? Asked the young man next to her. Their target was Yuning Han, and not taking advantage of this opportunity would be a waste. As for the rest of the people there, they just deal with anyone who got in their way. It wasn't that hard to handle things that way. The young man stepped out of the car and began walking toward the main gate. As expected, one of the guards stopped him and said he could only enter with an invitation. The man then reached into his coat as if looking for an envelope. The guard watched him cautiously, but instead of an envelope, he pulled out another object, and faster than the guard could react, the young man attacked him. One less obstacle to get through. Because of the shock and the speed of the attack, the other guard didn't even have time to react or alert the others. Well, now the entrance was clear. Over the radio, Shaemujin gave the command for Team 1 and Team 2 to enter the party. The two teams then sped up their cars and stormed in. Since they weren't subtle, their presence was quickly noticed. A battalion of armed men burst into the party, hijacking the party's sound system. Through the radio, Gangster warned everyone not related to Yuan Ming Han to stay calm. She instructed them to move toward any side wall, as their only target was the TS businessman. If they didn't start moving toward the walls right away, they would be treated as enemies. Yuan Ming Han observed the whole commotion, so they really had shown up. That meant he just needed to quietly slip out before the crowd started to panic. A scream was heard, and now a man lay on the ground in front of the gang. Unfortunately, that poor guy had been used as an example, so people would quickly understand how serious the situation was. That way, all the guests began to run in panic, while the businessman stood his ground. The gangster who had taken down one of the guests spotted him. Some guy was clearly curious about how things would unfold, but the detective didn't let him put his life at risk. Just because they were allies of the businessman didn't mean they had to fight for him. There were too many enemies, at least 24 of them. There was no way to send all of them to hell at once, and if Human Hand got caught, that wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing. After all, he was a powerful opponent. From the detective's point of view, that choice actually made sense. There wasn't much they could do there. The businessman tried to handle the situation as casually as possible, as if he had everything under control. One of the subordinates radioed the boss to say they had found the target. Where should they take him? She replied that they didn't need to take the man anywhere. Her order was simple: eliminate him. Her demon asked if she wasn't planning to throw him into her hell, but she answered that the rules were clear. Lucifer had said it was a death game, and sending people to hell wasn't the only way to win. If she showed up in person to send him to hell, it would be a risk. Besides, that pig of an architect had said that in addition to himself, the businessman had recruited some guy named Gagaka as well. The image of the architect, screening that information, flashed through her mind. The moment she stepped into that mansion, she would become an easy target. She was just being cautious. Although they understood what she was saying, her demon didn't really like the plan. After all, what he wanted was to see humans being sent to hell. She lets out a loud laugh and says that cherubim didn't need to worry. As soon as that game was over, she would send every gang member who was present. The day she got injured straight to hell. It seemed the businessman had everything under control. He snapped his fingers and said it was time to start the game. One of the gangsters asks if he had completely lost his mind, but little by little, armed men begin to emerge from the crowd and move toward the gangsters. The men start the fight, and it looks like those on Union Hand's side begin to take the advantage. They might have known his entire schedule. but there was no way they could have checked the full guest list. Before the party even started, the businessman had prepared himself by hiring several guards to blend into the crowd. He instructed them to stay in character without raising suspicion, and to keep an eye on everything around them. Jamujin wasn't the only one with powerful men at her disposal. He gave her credit for having the audacity to try attacking him. But what was she going to do now? In the shadows, the gangster smiles over the radio. Her men report the appearance of the guards, and that they couldn't even get close to the businessman. So she gives the command for groups 3 and 4 to break in. Once again, more cars begin to move and enter through the mansion. Yuning Han watches the situation unfold, and isn't surprised by the reinforcements. Slowly, he begins walking toward his mansion. It was time for her to make her move. So she tells her demon to go after that man and bring him as a gift. She would definitely make him the next commander of all hell. Cherubim steps out of the car and begins walking toward his target. The battle rages on in the mansion's garden, and when Cherubim arrives, his strength makes a big difference, shifting the pace of the fight. That demon had no physical form, but he was capable of possessing humans. However, during one of his punches, he ends up breaking the hand of the man he was possessing. A guy takes the opportunity and lands a clean hit from behind. At that moment, Cherub amuses the fact that his old shell was destroyed, and takes the body of the man who struck him. With a new possession complete, he smiles and feels better than ever. That body was even better than the previous one. But in the end, due to his nature, he didn't care who was an ally or not. So everything started to spiral into confusion and chaos. He yells for the other gangsters to use the time he's buying to storm the mansion. And with that new motivation, the men begin to move again. Meanwhile, the strategic battle between their two commanders continues, and piece by piece is removed from the board. It wasn't about the right timing to act. It was about doing whatever it took, no matter the cost. The banging sounds at the mansion's front door grow louder and louder. Gangsters were relentlessly slamming against it, trying to force it open. Another gangster arrives and literally kicks the door wide open, letting their men flood in. He commands his subordinates, telling them to split into groups of 2 or 3 and start the hunt. They couldn't leave without Un Hyen Han's head. That everyone scatters to search for their prey inside the mansion. In one of the rooms, 2 subordinates complain about how rich people love to show off. As they prepare to check the place thoroughly, one of them spots a closet, thinking there wouldn't be anyone inside, and opens it. But inside that closet was Gagaka holding his key in hand, and one by one he began swallowing the gangsters, dragging them into his invasion hell. The boy's hell had a condition. In theory, it wasn't supposed to function inside that mansion, but as a strategist he was. Before even creating any attack plan, Yuning Han had invested in a defense strategy. By taking the property documents of his estates, he added Gagaka's name to all of them, specifically, so the boy could activate his power on any of his private properties. That way the boy took the opportunity to prepare his territory by building various secret passages and traps inside the mansion. As a result, he could move freely and reach any corner of the house faster than anyone else, maximizing his abilities in the process. Meanwhile, Yuning Han watched everything from the VIP section. More people than he expected were ending up in Gagaka's hell. But even so, they still hadn't caught his true enemy. Where could the boss be after all? Finally, that whole battle had reached a stalemate. Cha Mu-jin realized that the members who had entered the mansion were disappearing quickly. All she could hear were their screams before being devoured. That power could belong to the businessman, or maybe to his other partner. Unfortunately, she had already sent all her men in there. She ordered the remaining members inside the mansion to exit to the garden, because it seemed like he couldn't use his key there, so it was a safe area. Little by little, they began to come out in the end. They weren't so dumb after all and were retreating. Now that things were getting fun and the boy was enjoying himself, they decided to leave with no more cards up his sleeve. He stayed inside the mansion and told Gagaka to do the same. Calling the police in that situation would be a waste of time. The only thing that could turn the tide in his favor was the alliance he had with Yum Sung-gai. Outside, the two of them held their positions just like all the other guests. Yum Sung-gai reached into his pocket and pulled out an earpiece. It's then they had one more player in the game. Someone even Yuning Han didn't know about. Hu Min-che was their secret trump card. He called her over the radio, and she responded saying she could hear him loud and clear. Liam Sung-gae, asked if she had managed to locate the player attacking the mansion. To use her power properly, she started running around the mansion. With her ability she could pick up Yimsung Georgia Park, Sangsik Yuning, Han Gagaga and one more person. She was close to the mansion's entrance. But since it was a woman, she wouldn't be able to drag her into the hell of lust. He said they couldn't move at the moment, and asked if the girl was willing to follow his orders. Well, she had almost died once, so at least she was sure he wouldn't betray her. She just said she was ready for anything. The first step was to try to make contact with that woman, to understand why she was still hiding. Most likely her hell's versatility was pretty low, and she wouldn't be able to do much with it. Besides, her demon was in the garden, so she had time. Slowly, she approached the car. Meanwhile, Xiao Mujin wondered what her next move could be. If the police showed up, she had no choice but to run. Suddenly, a girl opened her car door and startled her as if she knew her. The girl asked to come in, saying it was cold outside. The gangster asked who she was, and Human Che replied that it would be easier to show than explain, then pulled her key from her pocket. How did she know she was there? And more importantly, how did she know she was a hell creator too? Could that be her ability? The girl told her not to be scared. She wasn't there to fight. And the proof of her intentions was that her key wasn't reacting. There was someone who was interested in having a little chat with her. Then she took out her earpiece and placed it in Chai Mu Jin's ear. They began to talk and she asked what he wanted, since if he was in the garden, it meant he was hiding among the businessman's guests. Well, he really was hiding, but he had a goal, and for that he needed her help. His goal was to try to capture you, Ningen, together at that exact moment. She couldn't do anything from outside. And it was obvious, from the way her partners were just standing around in the garden. If she was willing to follow what he had to say, then he could catch the businessman by surprise. She wondered what she should do, since she didn't know that guy's true intentions. But as she had said, her hands were tied outside. Everything was going exactly the way Young Sung-gae wanted, and in the end she accepted that partnership. Little by little she passed new orders to her subordinates. They turned to the guests and threatened them to follow whatever the guy said. Everyone had to form a line. They were going to enter the house of the person who had invited them. Slowly they began to move and enter the mansion. Everything was going according to plan. Once all the hostages were inside, the new order was one gangster per guest. So each gangster chose a guest and paired up with them. It looked like a crazy three-legged race was about to begin through the mansion. The one who came up with that idea was Yun Song-gai. That was the best way to deal with Kagek's hell. He contacts Yuning Han and asks what he should do next. Unfortunately, all those people were his valuable clients. There were many publicly important individuals in that place. Besides the guests, what would the hell creators think of him? And how would he explain all of that to the authorities afterward? In other words, his hands were tied. For the sake of his reputation and his current business, he couldn't use his power. That said, he orders that under no circumstances should Gagaga use his ability, and that way, the gang members could continue their search with fewer problems. From the moment Young Sung-gae accepted that alliance, he had no interest in the player targeting Yoon Young Han, because the true danger in that game was the businessman himself, and eliminating him was what truly mattered. Yuning Han started having an anxiety attack. The gangsters, who had only been relying on brute force until then, now began to make strategically rational decisions. In other words, it seemed like the person in control of the situation had changed. But who was this new person behind it all? He had those three as his partners. Could his opponent also have other connections? No, that couldn't be possible. Most likely the person behind the new orders was someone on the inside, and that theory explained why they were able to create a system to counter Gagaka's power. He definitely didn't want to have to rely on his demon's ability, but the time had come to use it. He calls for Ram and he appears at his side. And so the businessman asks to use his future vision ability. That was the first time a human had ever requested it, so he would do it gladly. The demon strikes his staff on the floor. The eye of Horus begins to glow, and a magical pattern forms on the ground. And of course Ningen hadn't wanted to use that ability before, despite being overpowered. Could only be used 3 times. And he wouldn't be stupid enough to waste it on anything less urgent than what he was facing now. The room begins to shine. and the businessman sees fragments of the future unfolding. Over the next few hours they would find his hideout, and as expected the young Sung guy was behind it all. When he tried to use his key, he would be blocked and then attacked by the boy, and just like that he would lose his life. Right there he is, enraged to find out that Yum Sung guy was behind it all. If Baphomet's power was to detect the essence of death, then Ram's was to see what would happen in the near future and alter it. So over the radio he commands Gagaga to go after Yum Sung guy. But there was a problem. That person was a guest, not an intruder once again. The businessman doesn't know what to do. How long have that brat been planning all of this? In desperation he keeps his eyes glued to the security cameras, watching the boy's every step. In truth, Yum Sung guy hadn't planned it all out that far in advance. He didn't have enough information to build such a complex scheme, but he had allies and he could trust the detective to protect him. And Huimincha on the outside. Without them by his side, he never would have been able to win that information war. Unfortunately for Yu Ning Han, out of all his lucky days, this one was turning out to be a very unlucky one. Ram is stunned to see the human trembling like that. He had miscalculated from the beginning. He thought the detective and the person who kidnapped the architect were the biggest threats, but that student was a Trojan horse. At that exact moment he couldn't even rely on Gagaka's ability. He could only count on himself. He couldn't believe that someone like that, nobody had betrayed him. He would definitely judge that stupid kid's incompetence. So he gives the order for Gagaka to act. It didn't matter what the guests thought. They wouldn't be dragged into it either way. Gogeta is thrilled by that command. If he could act without as many restrictions, he absolutely would. His demon couldn't be more excited. And then he transformed into Yuningen. The whole thing would just become a game of tag with a fake decoy. And as expected his opponents were falling for the streamer's trap, like a bunch of clueless ducks. In that first wave they could already count 4 opponents out. He turned the key and the gates opened. Someone relayed the information that the businessman was near the lobby. It was time to forget the guests and take action. Yum Sung Gi couldn't understand why the gangster who was with him had run off, especially since he didn't have a comms device. Then he told him he had found the target in another part of the mansion. But that didn't make much sense. Staying alive even while hiding would be difficult. What the hell was that lunatic planning to do? The real Un Hai Han appeared and headed toward Yun Sung Gate, while Jin Jae Young distracted the others with his disguise. Ram asked what he was thinking and if he had a plan. After all, exposing himself like that wasn't exactly a wise move, but his goal was clear: find that little nerd and finish him. Then his demon asked how he planned to do that. That's when the businessman extended his key to him. He had the ability to foresee the future, something his opponent didn't have, which meant that compared to someone like him who had that power, someone like Yoon Sung Gi could be considered incompetent. To conclude, Yuning Han told Ram never to question him again. He truly hated the feeling that someone might be above him. After all came from nothing. An old woman walked down a dark hallway and opened a door. Inside that room was Union Han. 7 years old, she greeted him with all the warmth in the world and asked if he was hungry. She had brought roasted sweet potatoes for them to snack on. The child said he was studying and working hard to become a successful boss and have loads of money. His dream of being rich was so innocent. He just wanted a good life and to pay off his father's debts, so he and his grandmother wouldn't have to keep running. She gently stroked his head and said that even though the world of money and fame might dazzle the eyes, there were things more important than that. The child looked confused for a second, and his grandma said that, for example, the time they spent together couldn't be bought with money. After all, not everyone can be bought with money. There were things that not even a very rich person could obtain. In other words, she didn't want him to become someone like his father, who was blinded by money and ended up losing everything because of it. A few years later, they were in the law office. The bills had finally caught up to them. That amount of money couldn't possibly be paid by them. Because of that, his grandmother fell ill. Given her age, that's how a young Yuning Han ended up alone in the world. While he was still mourning his grandmother, a man approached him to collect payment for the cremation. With no money to pay, the man tried to yank the urn from his hands and it fell. It shattered, scattering his grandmother's ashes across the floor. From that point on, Yuning Han started working wherever he could. He remembered his grandmother's words, that not everything could be bought with money and fame. As he watched his belongings in the rain, He had been evicted and all his things were out on the street. That was when he became sure that without money and fame, he wouldn't be able to buy anything. He wrote a note to himself, saying never to let anyone look down on him again. Then, he started focusing on his studies and dedicating himself to his goal. He would do whatever it took to reach the top, leaving the weak behind, dismissing incompetent people, and aligning with those who could help him rise. That's how he managed to reach the top of KS Corporation, where his workers begged at his feet. But he didn't feel a shred of pity. After all, if they didn't want that negative result, all they had to do was stop being incompetent. It was better for that piece of trash to disappear from his sight. He wanted to show those who were born lucky, but were incompetent, what true hell really was. At that moment a being approached him, considering him confident for its goal. Had he ever considered dealing with the humans he hated in a different way than that? And it was then that he saw a way to never be at a disadvantage again. Walking through the mansion, he finally came face to face with Yun Sung Gai. The young man noticed his presence and was startled, since in theory he was supposed to be at the main hall. He was going to make Young Sun Gai pay the price for making him look like a fool. Young Sun Gai is start to see Yuning Han standing right in front of them. He was supposed to be in the entrance hall, not hear the businessman yells that he will make him pay for the crime of making him a fool. He approached the young man with such confidence, because he was certain he would win. His first certainty was that his opponent wouldn't be able to send him to hell, because most likely Yum Sun Gai's hell was less versatile than his own. Even during the fight against Kagaka, when they met at the hospital and even at the party, at none of those moments when his life was in danger did he use his ki, which indicated the limited versatility of his hell. Second certainty. Yom Sung Gai had already committed the sin of being incompetent, the act of blindly attacking an opponent without knowing their abilities, and always relying solely on rational judgment against someone as absurdly competent as Yoon Nam Han. He had made the mistake of rebelling, which leads them both to the current moment. But were the businessman's assumptions actually true? Had Yoon Sung Gi really committed the sin of being incompetent? Well, the result was clear. He hadn't reacted, which made the businessman even more doubtful. After all, if he was able to see the future and his opponent wasn't, then he became the incompetent one, not understanding why that was happening. Yudin Han turns to Ram and starts arguing with the demon. He asks, wasn't discovering Yom Sung Gi's move proof that he was more competent than the boy? Ram looks at him and swallows hard. No matter how much his human screamed, the outcome had already been decided. The young man begins to smile. Being able to predict the future really was an amazing ability. But what else could he do in that situation? Even if he approached Yom Sung Gi right now, the young man wasn't sensing the essence of death, which meant that Yuningen was no longer a threat to him. A crime is defined by human actions. But does just thinking about killing someone make a person a criminal? The correct answer was no. So the future that Yoon Young Han had foreseen and tried to change could no longer be considered a crime. Even if he had predicted Yoon Sung Gi's crime, he had already made sure it didn't happen. To seal the coffin shut, the young man throws it in his face that the businessman had never understood how to properly use his own abilities. Yuning Han is left in complete shock that nobody was right because of the restriction of only being able to see the future 3 times a year. That had been the first time he really used the ability, and because he waited so long, his lack of knowledge backfired on him. Even so, he still believed that Yun Sung Gai wasn't capable of sending him to hell, and so nothing would change, except the young man's ki was glowing. Young Han Han wonders why that didn't happen in his vision, but was happening now. The fact was clear. By changing the future, Yum Sung Gai was now capable of sending him to his hell. After all, the businessman had committed the sin of betrayal against him. He begins to scream in desperation, because he had always made the right choices in life, but it was exactly because of that he was being judged for always choosing the option that benefited only himself. Betraying someone became inevitable. The portal opened and the tentacles reached out toward Yoon Eun Hai, and thus the businessman was captured, dragged into Yun Sung Gi's hell, letting out his final screams before the doors closed completely. A winner had been decided. Sometimes being a little patient is the best choice, because he made the decision not to attack the detective that day. He ended up catching Yuningen, So that's his end, says Ram as he dissolves in front of the other two. Baphomet couldn't have been happier. They move on to their next objective. But Yamsung-Gai's legs give out for a brief moment. Baphomet asks why he reacted like that. They still had many players left to eliminate. Yamsung-Gai replies that he wasn't being soft, but the tension that built up when those gangsters invaded the party, and the quick thinking he had to rely on to beat you. Ning Han in the final seconds. He had completely exhausted him. A normal human wouldn't be able to adapt that quickly to a situation like that. His abilities were definitely improving, and now it was time for them to end it all. On one side were the guests of the businessman Yoon In-han. On the other were the members of Cha Mu-jin's gang. A complex situation for hell creators like Kagak and Park Sang-sik, but using the filming room to his advantage. The young son, Guy, began thinking of a solution to organize all that chaos. It was time to clean things up. On his phone he dialed the number for the police. To enhance his performance, he placed a finger on his throat and started coughing. The officer answered, and with a hoarse voice, he began yelling that there were gangsters at the party he was attending, and that everything was in chaos. In response, the officer asked for the location. Liam Sunggi's act had been flawless. He had called the police because he needed to clean up that mess as quickly as possible. After all, there were many normal people and players in the same place. If anything unusual happened, everyone would start panicking and attacking. And the second reason for calling the police was that he needed Chi Mu-jin's allies to be restrained quickly. And so it happened. The police arrived and began arresting the gangsters one by one. But there was still one active variable. The girl's demon was among those being arrested, and at the first chance he got, he possessed a police officer, taking over the man's body for himself. He realized something was wrong. He needed to protect his human immediately, so he dropped the gun in his hands and ran toward her. Kim Sung-Gai watched everything through the security camera and told Human Che to get out of the car right away. She took her earpiece back and stepped out of the vehicle. Yuning Han had been taken down, so her job there was done. She said goodbye to Cha Mu-jin and ran off, as if she were just a local resident. Shortly after, Cherubim arrived at the car, worried about his human. But everything that happened had left her in a difficult situation. She hadn't expected someone as formidable and strategic as Yoon Han to exist without even lifting a finger against his opponent. He had managed to capture him and still made a fool out of her. They needed to get out of there fast. That guy she had talked to on the phone, he was dangerous. Meanwhile, young Sung Ji considered how to destroy the evidence recorded that day. He pulled out some cables and threw the computer across the room. He kept kicking the black box until it short-circuited. The police couldn't know anything about what had happened that night. If they did, a witch hunt for hell creators would begin. He grabbed a fire extinguisher and sprayed it on the computers. With that act, almost everything was ready. Now he just had to blend into the crowd and get out of there. Baphomet asked if there was still anything left for them to do. Yum Sung-Gai stopped. The one thing missing was Yuning Han's ally, the streamer Gagaga. With the arrival of the police, and no way to reach the businessman anymore, he had the same idea as Yun Sung Ji and blended into the crowd to escape. Out of nowhere he was stopped, which gave him a huge scare. But the person who came up from behind was just a friendly police officer, saying he'd escort him home. No need to be afraid, he thanked him and got into the car, barely believing he had made it out alive. But little did he know that the third reason Yun Sung-Gai had called the police was because the detective had a way of separating Gagaka from the other guest. Once inside the car, Gagaka sighed in relief, barely believing he had survived. He gave the officer his address, but the streamer had no idea that the one taking him was another hell creator. Just like him, Park Sang-sik started the engine and took the road. But halfway through, Kagaka noticed something was off. It didn't look like they were heading toward the city center. That's when he decided to look at the driver and saw Detective Park Sang-sik. Yuman Han had told him the detective was an ally, but if he was taking him to some strange place while the businessman was missing, then maybe he was an imposter. He needed to get out of that car immediately. He could take advantage of the fact that it wasn't going that fast to try and jump out, but he hadn't considered that maybe the door was locked, leaving him completely trapped alone with his enemy. A patrol car wasn't the same as a taxi. The doors couldn't be opened so easily. Kagaka tries to threaten him with his key, and says that since he was driving, that put him at a disadvantage. The threat had no effect on Fernando, and he tells Gagaga to go ahead and open the portal. The boy is left speechless by his response. He thought he still had that card up his sleeve, but that wasn't the case. Bluffing wasn't going to work against the detective anymore. Fernando had a few theories about the young man's power. First, he had always sent people to hell in specific places. In other words, his power had a location restriction for activation. If the place didn't belong to him, he couldn't open the portal. Then he pulls out his own key and threatens that if Gagaga didn't want to open his own hell, the detective could do it for him. With a number of people the boy had already sent to hell, there was no way he was innocent. So if he wanted to stay alive a little longer, he'd better sit quietly like a good boy. Realizing he had no way out, Gagaga agrees to the officer's terms. They finally arrive at their destination, and none of it in Carlos is waiting for them. Somehow the young man had managed to arrive there first. He jokes that the taxi driver played fast and furious when he offered to double the fare. Well, the important thing was that he made it safely, and it was time for the main character to enter. Says the detective. He opens the door and faster than a rabbit, Gagaga jumps out of the car. He kneels in front of Carlos and starts repenting, saying he was wrong, he would do anything to be forgiven. But as soon as he raises his head, he realizes it won't be that easy. Two looked at him as if he were some inferior creature. That was the guy Yuning-han had said was the detective's lackey. But it looked like the story was different actually. The detective was his subordinate. The businessman had underestimated that nerd, and ended up being defeated. If it had been the gangsters, at least a body would have been found. Carlos approaches the kneeling boy, who turns his face away. He says that as Gaga had probably noticed, Yuning-han was now in his hell. So what should they do with the little rat who was left behind? Shamelessly the redhead tries to plead for his life, but if he wanted to live he had to prove himself useful. Carlos gives a slight smile. He had already thought about taking advantage of Bigaka ever since he saw him at the mansion. All because Bigaka's hell condition was great for defense. Put another way, it was like a laser tower that automatically eliminated intruders. But even more useful than that was the power of his demon, Jinjan, with that key to confuse the enemy, or even use him as a decoy before facing the final battle. Dealing with Kagaku was indispensable, but for now, since they were still in the middle of the game, he was still usable from afar. Someone watches the mess of police cars outside the mansion. Now that the police had arrived, unfortunately the game was over for now. That was the demoness Sumana. She asks her human Jane Doe who she thinks won the battle, and she replies that Yuning-han had lost. Even though she once thought he was a strong candidate, because if he had actually won that battle, he surely wouldn't have called the police. To avoid damaging his reputation or exposing himself, if he wanted to clean things up, he would have called his private security team. So there was only one possible answer. But it probably wasn't the gangster who subdued him either, because it made no sense to abandon her subordinates like that. There was a third person involved. Samantha praises her human. She really was smart, so their next target could only be that third person involved. After all, they liked going after big fish. Jane Doe presses her pen to her clipboard. Before he could flip the game board they had built, they needed to send him to hell. In a messy room, John Chu lies wrapped in his blanket. Gorgon Khalees wasn't too pleased to see him like that. He knew the human was traumatized, but sitting at home doing nothing wouldn't help. The architect keeps whining about being tired of the whole situation. Tired of Yu Sung-han. Tired of the gangsters. Look at him. His precious fingers had been broken. After all that, he definitely didn't want to go out anymore. He just stayed home ordering food. He only made a contract with the demon because his co-workers were annoying. He never wanted a life like this. Gorgon obviously was also regretting having chosen that man as his human. Suddenly the doorbell rang. John Chul asked for the package to be left at the door, but the doorbell wouldn't stop ringing. Annoyed, he got out of bed and walked toward the door. He thought he would come face to face with the delivery person, but instead he found himself facing another demon and his human. The child in front of him was Song Min-woo. Despite his age, he was also a demon creator. The news was covering nothing else. Every channel was talking about the strange disappearance of the TS conglomerate director, Liam Sungai listened to the broadcast while doing his morning jog. It seemed like they had entered a moment of peace. The tension surrounding the hunt had lessened. Gagak and the young Sungai even spent time playing video games, and having fun even so. Hu Min Cho continued her research. Song Min Woo was still attending his classes normally. Cha Mu Jin also did her part to try and recover the partner she had lost. Jane Doe took the time to calmly build her strategy, and the reason for that peace was simple. With the elimination of Eun Young Han, the game had become more balanced. When there are too many players, it's easier to search and expose their weaknesses. A good amount of time had passed since the start of the game, and everyone had started to understand the rules better and better, realizing they would literally become easy targets if they drew too much attention. Lucifer watched them. Only 7 players remained now, but that much calm didn't suit the King of Hell, and he was starting to get bored. Suddenly a demon manifested beside him. His name was Temeagle, Lucifer's assistant. He said that formation was expected. After all, games with too many players naturally lead to alliances and balance. But the king complained. In the game he had participated in 700 years ago, it hadn't gone like that. The tension of not being able to rest for even a moment. The ruthless battles, that was what he had been expecting to see. So Temeagle suggested creating a plan to break the calm. The king looked at him, intrigued by the idea. His assistant then pointed to one of the participants on the screen. Why not call that young man in for a little chat? After all, he was the one who had caused the balance in the game, and he was the center of the alliance. Meanwhile, in the real world, Yun Sung Ji continued his walk but stopped to catch his breath. Baphomet appeared behind him, asking if the human wasn't tired of running like that. The young man replied that it was his stamina that had saved him during the fight with the serial killer. Besides, he didn't know what kind of player he might encounter in the future, or what kind of demon abilities. Baphomet didn't know whether to praise him for being meticulous or diligent. Yom Sung Ji took the opportunity to ask how things were in hell, and if anyone was trying to escape. Demon summoned his surveillance tablet. He said there were attempts, especially from the smarter ones, but they both knew that no matter how hard they tried, Yum Sung Guy was a genius. There was no escape from his hell. There wasn't even a sign that the sinners were trying to stage an attack or hatch a plan. Suddenly the brick he was holding on to broke free from the wall, dragging Yu Ning Han back into the pit. But Baphomet still had a question. He wanted to know how long he intended to maintain that alliance. They were halfway through the game, and keeping such a big alliance was risky. It would be even harder if he started developing feelings. Maybe the others would try to take him out first. The image of Human Choi and Park Sang-sik, activating their keys and apologizing, flashed through his mind. Yum Sung Ji fell silent. He put a hand on Baphomet's shoulder and said that, in the end, that was for him to decide. The demon just needed to keep trusting him. Of course he wanted to trust him, but he also didn't want to be annihilated because of human emotions. As they talked, something unexpected happened. They both looked alertly in the same direction. Through the smoke, Temeagle emerged, offering his greetings. Clearly, he was interested in Yom Sung Gae and his dominance in the game, but since he wasn't used to it, the demon couldn't manage to say the young man's full name to him. Human names were confusing, so he just called him Yum something. Baphomet asked what he wanted showing up like that. Yum Sung Gae asked who he was, and the horned one replied that he was Baphomet's assistant and successor. At first he wondered why a demon like that would suddenly appear, but then he remembered at the beginning of the game, Baphomet had said that Lucifer could change the rules at any moment, just on a whim, so that moment had arrived. He asks if the demon had shown up to announce some new rule. Temeagle praises the young man for his quick thinking, but before any rule, in fact, Lucifer wanted to have a word with him. The assistant then extends his hand, and a portal opens beneath the 3 beings. Suddenly all of them are inside Lucifer's palace. He welcomes them and says that this was his office. Baphomet immediately kneels while Yum Sung Gae is still confused. Lucifer says he knew how confident Baphomet was, but he hadn't expected his human to be just as confident. He managed to gather 4 out of the 7 remaining players, without using force, and even recruited a candidate who wasn't all that strong. The demon responds that those compliments made him a bit embarrassed, but Lucifer corrects him, he wasn't complimenting them. The king approaches the 2 of them furious. The Horn One and his human were ruining his game. He wanted a game full of excitement with epic battles, and they were turning it into a team-based game. with partnerships that even little kids could play. He tries to calm down a bit after venting his anger. King would like to order the demon to choose another human to replace Yun Sung Gai, but that wouldn't be fair and would be too arbitrary, since they hadn't broken any of the game's rules. Because of that, he decided the two of them would receive a small penalty. Lucifer snaps his fingers and two screens appear. On one screen was Human Cha, and on the other Park Sang-sik. The king of hell gives a sinister smile, and says that Yum Sung-ji had 1 week to send one of the two to hell. Yum Sung-ji tries to process what Lucifer had just said. He turns to Baphomet and asks if something so forced could really exist. He had played by the rules without breaking a single one. It wasn't fair to ask him to turn against his allies just like that. The demon tells him to be careful with what he says. After all, standing before him was Lucifer, the king of hell. Even so, the human insists there was no reason for them to receive that penalty if they hadn't broken any rules of the game. So bold, comments Lucifer, and he was definitely right to have signed a contract with Baphomet. But this was his will after all. That game was only happening for his own entertainment. In other words, if Yum Sung-ji didn't want to follow the new rules, he could be replaced at any time. That was the moment Yum Sung-ji felt the true power of the king. What he now had to do was choose who would remain his ally, and who he would drag to hell. Well, that was all Lucifer had to say. Now they could return and make their choice. Before they went back to the human world, Lucifer taps Baphomet and tells him not to dare let the game become boring again. After those final words, they return to where they were. Yim Sung-ji's left hand starts to tingle. When he pulls up his sleeve to see what it is, he discovers a countdown timer on his arm, meaning he had a time limit. That counter was both a problem and a reminder that they were forced to do whatever the king wanted. Yum Sung-gai begins to think about Park Sang-sik and Hu Min-cha. He knew that at some point in the game, he would have to eliminate both of them. But now he turns the key and enters the detective's house. Sitting down on the couch, thinking both rationally and emotionally, eliminating one of them wasn't part of Yum Sung-gai's principles, at least not at that point in the game, and definitely not like this. So he comes up with something and decides to ask his demon a question. But before he can say anything, Baphomet interrupts and asks if he's going to ask something like, which of the two is more useful or something like that. But that wasn't quite what Yum Sung-gai had in mind. In fact, he wanted to ask more about the demons, especially about Lucifer. Baphomet doesn't really understand where the human was going with this. So the young man begins by wanting to know how Lucifer managed to gain the power to control hell, and if there was any way for Baphomet to take his place. Demon looks at him shocked. Of all the things he considered, that line of thought had never crossed his mind. The king had earned his position because he created the greatest of all hells, which was the hell of disbelief, and that hell was a masterpiece. Never before had there been a hell so full of humans, screaming and crying in despair. Never before had there been a hell with such good structure, versatility and taste. In other words, the success of his hell is what causes his position to rise, and he quickly ended up taking over hell's power to be based on that. But someone important was missing from that story. What could have happened to Dante? Well, as for him, the human was granted eternal life as compensation. So that means Dante was the first hell creator in the world, and there's a possibility he's still alive. In theory, yes, he was the first and he was probably still alive. But then if Dante were thrown into hell, what would happen to Lucifer? The voice of a priest could be heard from within the cathedral. He preached the word of God about believing in faith. Meanwhile, his followers listened with fervor. That priest was none other than Dan himself, the creator of the hell of disgrace. In theory, if Dan, the human who had met Lucifer, were thrown into hell, the king would disappear. Young Sun-gai stood up immediately, but Baphomet already began rejecting that idea. After all, it was just a theory. Dealing with the owner of hell wouldn't be that easy. He just had to make a choice and try to stay in the game until he was the last one standing. That would be the safest route to keep them alive. But Yom Sung-ji was determined. After all, there were a few variables to be calculated from now on. What if Lucifer changed his mind? He could continue the game while keeping the rules he had already made, but start adding absurd specific conditions just for me. In other words, I'm a thorn in his side, and there's a higher chance he'll change his mind before the game ends just to prevent me from winning. They stared at each other for a moment, and Baphomet couldn't deny it. he himself was making high-ranking demons fight each other, which was an absurd trick to consolidate power. And now he wanted to put a leash on young Sun Guy. On top of that, there was a high probability that the young man's hell would endure. In the future, the demon remained motionless, so he wanted to know what his human's idea was after all, since it might end up creating a competition for control of hell. Sung Ji simply extended his arm to Baphomet and said that if this worked, his chances of survival would be 100%. Our video ends here. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, bye-bye.